What's up, everyone? Dan here with another interview with another spectacular comic creator. I've been looking forward to talking with this man for quite a long time, and he's got some really interesting stuff going on now and has had a very storied career that we're going to be able to talk with him about, and that is Mr. Christopher Priest. Thank you for taking the time to sit down and talk with me.
Hey, thanks, Dan. Thanks for having me on. Appreciate it.
Yes, sir. Um, And one thing I like everyone I interview, I always like to start by asking them, what was it that got you interested in comics to begin with? And what did you read when you first got interested in it?
Well, like everybody else, I started reading comics when I was a kid. My mom bought me my first comic. It was an issue of Superman's pal, Jimmy Olsen,
Okay.
where Jimmy was, for whatever reason, dressed like a pirate. And I don't remember what the story was about, but there was a ship, there was a storm at sea, and Jimmy was the pirate, and Superman has to rescue the ship. I don't remember, but I was 8 years old and I was enthralled. And I think mom regretted that for the rest of her life because I started piling up all these comics, and then mom would be fussing at me to get rid of them, and sometimes I'd come home from school and find out mom was throwing out my comics,
Oh,
and moms, any moms listening to me, please don't throw out your kids. I mean, come on, that's a commodity. We could,
yeah.
if you get some candy, you eat the candy and it's gone. You know, comic books, you can reread them, you can trade them, you can, I took like the New Gods series, the whole New Gods series, I took the staples out and I cut them at the spine and I stapled them together into big blocks of paper. So I
Mhm.
had like the whole New Gods series, like, and it's all gone. It's all got
Oh
busted
man.
out. Yeah, nice going there.
My dad told me once that when I was a kid, because I read a lot of comics, that someone they knew asked him, like, doesn't it bother you that he's reading comics all the time? And he told him no, because he's reading.
Yeah. Well, yeah. And I think, Larry Hama was my mentor. He taught me
Hmm.
a lot about the business. I started working for him when I was 18 or 19. And one of the things Larry said was that, don't make fun of comic book readers because anybody who reads anything these days is a step ahead of, your average bear.
Yeah.
They're certainly on the right road. And again, I don't know how comics got a reputation for being, anti-intellectual or junk food, but if you read The Flash, you learned a lot about the properties of speed, the properties of light. If you read Green Lantern, you started learning about, interstellar travel and a lot of this, theory about outer space and extraterrestrial species and so forth like that. And I learned a lot from comics. And I think that people should stop bad mouthing them. I think that's a bad idea.
And if you read Power Girl, you learned about something else.
Yeah, well, did she ever have her own series, Power Girl?
Yeah, she hasn't had anything ongoing for a long time. She's had mini series and short runs of series, 20 or 30 issues, but nothing long term.
I think that the temptation with characters like Power Girl and like I write Vampirella,
Yeah.
and now I'm starting on Red Sonja, and I think the temptation with these characters is to just work the suit.
Yeah.
Okay, here's Batgirl, and I see all these posters of all these shots of Batgirl, and they're all like pinup shots of Batgirl, and she's kind of posing, ooh, I'm Batgirl,
Mhm.
and I'm like, yeah, but who's inside the suit? Who is this character? What are her challenges? What are her conflicts and challenges, and what are her struggles, and what are her goals? So with Karen, with Power Girl, that's what I'd like to do. And when I approach these characters, always start inside it, dig inside the character and work outward, as opposed to just starting with, okay, she's we're working this suit,
Yeah.
and now we put together our plot. The meteor is coming, and oh my, what will we do, and how will Power Girl stop the meteor? Rather than that, I want to just make it character driven and
Mhm.
and go, okay, here's a person who was completely displaced from her own reality, and she's in our reality, but that this is not her home.
Yeah.
Okay, now what does that mean to her, and how do we craft the story out of that? Then we write the story out of the character's particular conflict.
Hmm. Now, I read when you got started, you were an intern for Marvel in, was it 1978? How did you get an internship with them?
Just sheer luck. There was a program with the New York City public school system. It was a New York City high school internship program where students could sign up for whatever their career occupations were, whatever their aspirations were. I signed up for interviews with, I think, 4 or 5 law firms and Marvel Comics. I saw Marvel Comics on the list, and I thought, this can't be right. This really, instead of going to school, I'm going to go to Marvel Comics all day, you know. But I went, okay, fine, I'll sign up for it. Now, at the time, and I forget which girlfriend I was in love with at the time. I believe it was a young lady named Valerie, who is now an attorney for the city of New York, and she hates me. But I believe I was chasing around after Valerie at the time. And being 17,
Yeah.
just obsessed as 17-year-olds are and following your hormones around. I skipped the law firms. I just blew off the interviews. I just didn't show up. But I made up. I showed up for the Marvel thing, and I'm sitting in the reception area of Marvel Comics. And at the time, they had a receptionist. Her name was Josie. Josie was maybe the most insanely beautiful woman I'd ever seen in my life. I mean, oh my God, everybody loved Josie. And then out the door, out of the main office, comes the tallest white man I'd ever seen. And he wants to. He's dragging people back, one by one for the interview. I thought I was going to be interviewed by Archie Goodwin because I read in a comic book that Archie Goodwin was the editor in chief of Marvel. Who's this guy? So it was kind of and I had the interview and I went home and I thought nothing of it. And I think it was a week or two later, I got contacted by my school and they said that you had been selected out of all these other kids to be an intern. So in September, I think it was 8th or 9th of 1978, I showed up at Marvel Comics, met Jim Shooter. Jim Shooter takes me down the hall to the bullpen, and he introduces me to my first friend at Marvel Comics, who was this kid, in the bullpen. And he says, John, this is Jim, and Jim, this is John. And I go, okay. And he just lights up with this big grin, and he goes, oh, I'm so glad to see you. And he takes this lanyard from behind, on his neck, and he puts it ceremonially. He puts it over my neck, and he goes, "You are now officially the key operator of the Xerox machine." Because he was so sick of doing that job, and that's how I met John Romita Jr.
Wow.
We were the same age, so he was 17 at the time.
Wow. That's a great story.
Mm-hmm.
And then
day one, yes.
Wow. And then was it in 79 you started working as an editor for Crazy Magazine? How did you go from intern to editor?
Paul Lakin was the
Mhm.
editor of Crazy Magazine at the time. I had completed the internship and I was doing some freelance proofreading for an editor named Nelson Yomtov. And somehow, I think either Shooter or Nelson mentioned me to Paul, that Paul was looking for someone. Paul worked out of his house, which was in Long Island or somewhere like that, and he wanted someone who could be in the office and kind of mind the office when he wasn't there. And somebody mentioned me. They said, "We got this kid here," so I would come over after school, and Paul would have laid out whatever artwork came in. I would process the vouchers and take the artwork down to production, blah 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 blah. And then when the book was ready, I'd proofread the book, or I'd get Paul's notes back and forth, however it worked. And then I would take the book physically over to wherever there was a company called Chemical Color, or whatever the name of that company was back in those days, that would handle creating the negatives and the proofs and stuff. Because Crazy Magazine was a black and white book, so there was no color involved in it. But so I basically trafficked and I maintained the office and I trafficked that stuff, and I did it after school every day. and I got paid $50 a month,
Oh,
50 whole bucks a month for it. Yeah, and I would have done it for nothing just because I loved being up at Marvel. Marvel was a great place to be in those days. It was a complete madhouse.
Nelson Yamta. He worked on Transformers.
He worked on everything. He was a colorist. He was an
Yeah,
editor. He was, a drummer in Larry Hama's band.
yeah,
Nelson. Yeah, Nelson was a great guy. I mean, is still a great guy.
yeah. If I remember right, he's the only person that worked on every issue of that all 80 issues of Transformers
Wow.
when Marvel did. I think he was a colorist on every issue, and and no one else worked on all of them.
That,
Writer.
that's fascinating. Yeah. I was the editor on Transformers as of issue 5, so
Mhm.
I had the privilege of producing issue 5 in a 4-issue limited series, because they did a 4-issue limited
Yeah.
series and then they decided to keep it going. So I'm like number 5 in a 4-issue limited series, Transformers. And I called up my dear friend, the late Mark Bright, and I said, "Look, I want you to paint the cover for issue 5. They've never had a painted cover before."
That was a
So we
gorgeous cover.
Yeah, you know what I'm talking about, the Transformers and then
Yeah,
scroll on the wall
with
are all
Soundwave
there.
or with Shockwave.
Yeah, with
Yeah.
Shockwave there. So I sketched that out for him. So I actually designed that cover. I take credit for that cover. I did design the cover, and Mark came in and I gave it to him and I talked to him about it, and he said, "Okay." Well, no, I think probably he said what he usually says is, "Oh, Jim, that's just stupid." Because that's what he said to everything that we did together.
Yeah.
But he did that cover. It was absolutely fabulous. I was knocked out when first time I saw it. I sent it over to, I want to say, Hasbro.
Yeah, Hasbro.
Is that them? Hasbro.
Yeah.
So I sent it over to them. They rejected it,
Wow.
and I got the lady on the phone, and she said, "Well, if the kids think the Transformers are all dead, they won't buy the toys." And what I wanted to say is, lady, how stupid do you think? It's a comic book. They know the Transformers are
Yeah.
not all dead. What are you doing here? So we had to do some politicking. A lot of times, Dan, the people who are administrating the rights for these particular properties, whether it's Micronauts or GI Joe or whatever, they're not necessarily creative people. They are lower level, entry level people who are reading from a script or have a set of guidelines or whatever it
Yeah.
is. But they're just being, pardon the pun on Transformers, they're just being robots. They're
Yeah.
just going, well. They this criteria, that criteria, that criteria, as opposed to a creative person. Because a creative person would have known immediately that it's a gag and it's a really good gag. But no, the kids are not going to stop buying.
Yeah. I mean, how many times have we seen on a cover, does Superman live through this? Like, obviously he does, because
Right.
there's a comic coming out next month.
Right. There was a great issue of Detective. I forgot which issue it was. Neil Adams drew it. And this was Denny and Neil. Where Robin is coming through the window and he gets mowed down by machine gun fire, and I'm like, "Oh no, Robin is mowed down by machine gun fire!" And
Yeah.
now, of course, Dan, I have got to. There was an issue of Action Comics again. Neil Adams. Okay, Superman. We're inside his son's room. I didn't know Superman had a son, but we're inside his son's room. Superman is coming through the door, and sitting in front of Superman is Superman's son, and Superman's son is wearing the Superman outfit, and he's in the process, the Superman's son, of transforming into a gorilla. And Superman says, "Oh no, my son is. This is a real cover. Go find
Yeah.
it. Oh no, my son is turning into a gorilla." And I'm like 9 or 10 years old. But I lost my mind. I have got to read this. And I'm like that. Julie Schwartz was just an absolute genius about this stuff, because Julie would like create these covers or come up with these cover ideas, and then hand the cover idea to the writer and say, "Go make sense out of this." And I'm like, whoa. I miss the days when the cover would absolutely draw you in, where you'd look at the
Yeah.
cover and go, "All right, I got to find out what's going on here. The Transformers are all dead. Okay, here's my 35 cents. I'm in."
Yeah. Yeah, because not just the gorgeous cover that makes you want to say, like, are they? I thought maybe on this too. I thought,
I think they go. I think we know they're not actually dead, but
yeah.
I'm going. I have got to read this. I got to see what's going on here.
And the last issue of that, issue 80, was, as a kid I loved it, and even today I still love it. I still think it's one of the coolest things where it said issue 80 in a 4-issue limited series.
Did it really?
Yeah, right at
'Cause
the top
I
of it.
was
I was
long
like,
gone by then.
even now I'm like, oh man, that's so cool.
That's funny. That's
So
hilarious. Yeah, because I think it started with issue 5 of a 4-issue miniseries, and they just made the joke come full circle at some point.
yeah,
Those were just the good old days. I mean, Dan, I guess you kind of hear that a lot when you talk to like people of my generation. Well, Sonny, let me tell you, those were the good old days.
yeah,
It just Marvel was exactly what it seemed to be. If you
mhm,
read the bullpen bulletins and Stan Lee's soapbox and I'm pretty sure. Well, actually, I don't know. I'm pretty sure Stan did not write a lot of those, but there was somebody, doing that for him,
yeah,
or maybe it was. I don't really know. But the point is, it just he lent the idea that Marvel was this magical place where people were just turning cartwheels and they were juggling and going on, and yeah, and it was just a bunch of just shenanigans and stuff going on because it was. So it's exactly what it was. It was the
yeah,
most undisciplined, unbusinesslike place that you could possibly imagine. And at the time that I was there, behind every door at Marvel Comics in those days was an artisan. And what I mean by that is that these were not bureaucrats, these were not administrators. These were writers and artists and colorists and letterers, and like everybody, to the left of me of our office, that was Al Milgram's office, and Joe Duffy, Mary Jo Duffy, who was the writer of Power Man Iron Fist, that was his assistant. And then next on the other side of us, that's Carl Potts' office.
mhm,
And Carl Potts was this, wonderful writer and artist, and so forth. Across the hall was Denny O'Neil, and then you keep going down the hall, and you're running into Len Wein and Marv Wolfman. They worked at home, but when they came into the city, they shared an office in the back. Dave Cockrum was in the office next door to him, the legendary X-Men guy.
yeah,
Marie Severin was the art director. She was replaced by John Romita Sr., who took on that role after she moved on. But there was behind every door, pretty much, there was an inker, a penciler. Michael Golden eventually came on board, and Michael Golden moved in down the hall, and he was a pip to work with all the time. So it was just it was a magical place. I was on roller skates half the time because the place was huge, and I had to keep going up and down the hall and stuff. And I got tired of that, so I brought my roller skates in. And his little black kid just, down the hall, you know, parties all the time. Any excuse to have a party, any excuse to, order pizza. It was a family. It was the most racist, sexist, un-PC place in the world. I mean, were there black jokes? You betcha. But there were Jewish jokes, there were Italian jokes, there were, everything except there were no Polish jokes. You know why?
why?
Jim Shooter.
Oh, yeah,
Jim
yeah,
Shooter was Polish, yes. So ironically, we had all these different sort of like really ribald stuff you couldn't get away with now.
yeah,
And I didn't think anything about it. I never took any of it seriously. Not a lot of it was directed at me. I mean, it wasn't like they were just making fun of me or even making fun of black people in general. It was just like anything went. I mean, if you ever saw the TV show Mad Men,
oh yeah,
where they were throwing around a lot of racist and sexist language and treating the women in a very sexist manner, and there was a lot of drinking. There was a lot of drinking at Marvel in those days. There was cigarette smoking at Marvel.
yeah.
It was a completely, and here's this kid, growing up at Marvel. Hey, that's the title for the memoir.
There
Growing up
you
at
go.
Marvel.
But well, you mentioned, you were the first African American editor in mainstream comics. When you got to that, did you realize that you were the first one, or was it just, hey, I'm an editor?
No, I was just happy to be there. I was just having fun, and everybody up there was family. Even people who didn't like me and people I didn't like. You
Mm-hmm.
know, there's probably people in your family that you don't necessarily like. You won't say it out loud, but you'll
Yeah.
say, "Oh God, here's cousin Buzz," you know, whatever the story is. You know, but uh, it was they were really an extended part of my family, and most of these people who were in that extended part of my family are people who are foundational to what Marvel, ultimately became. These were, the bedrock people. I didn't pay any attention to who's the first or what, because I was hanging out with Ron Wilson and I was hanging out with Trevor Von Eden. And then once I got my own office on check day, which was I think Friday, it was Thursday or Friday, the freelancers would kind of swarm into the office to get their checks, and a lot of the black guys would come into my office, and hang out at my office, and they'd hang out at my office because I knew them, and in the case of a guy like Dennis Cowan, I've known Dennis since he was 17. I met him the same time I met Jerry R. So
Mm-hmm.
we go way back. So Dennis would come in and hang out at my office, and Trevor Von Eaton would come in and hang out at my office. Ron Wilson and Randy DeLoach, and here's Keith Williams, the inker, and Mark Beecham, and on and on and on. So they would, eventually at some point, some staffer whose name I won't mention because, don't start none, won't be none, but I know who you are. Some staffer came by my office, saw all these black people in the office, went to go see Shooter, and he's like, they're having a meeting.
Oh my God.
So Shooter pops up in my office, and he's really embarrassed. I hate to ask you this question. It wasn't me, but somebody brought it to my attention, and I feel like I have no choice, but I have to look into it. And I go, Jim, what are you talking about? Just spit it out. And he's like, well, there's a rumor going around that you're firing all the white, talent and replacing them with black talent. And I thought, well, this is just the most insane thing, and I said, look, the guys, it was check day. They're waiting for the checks to come down. By the way, Joe Rubenstein was in my office. Did anybody note that? Bob Layton practically lived in my office.
Yeah.
So Joe Rubenstein, Layton was there. There was any number of people who were not necessarily African American who were there, but Kyle Baker was there, and William Johnson, who you may not remember, but he drew some issues of Transformer. He was there,
Mm-hmm.
and they were there because they felt welcome in my office.
Yeah.
To be honest with you. And because I had a cool office, I had a stereo, and I had like these mood lights, and so I got like Miles Davis playing, and I had a palm tree. I went upstairs to the 9th floor and stole this potted palm tree out of the hallway, and put it in my office. And I had this big beach ball, and we're throwing the beach ball around in the office, and that's why they were in my office. It's not a racial thing. Is it a racial thing? Is Bobby Layton in my office because it's a racial thing? I mean, it was a good vibe. It was a cool place to hang out. And a lot of them just stored their portfolios there and before they went wandering up and down the hall looking for work. And that's all it really was.
Well, and you had mentioned Larry Hama, a couple times that he was, your mentor. And so when you left, or when you went from Crazy, that to kind of, I guess, Marvel proper, that you were working with him as an editor and a writer on the Conan book. So what was it like going from the, like the humor book with Crazy to stuff like Conan? And, what was it you learned? You said Larry was your mentor. What kind of stuff did you learn from him that helped you out in your career?
Well, with Larry, if you sit in a room with someone long enough and you hear them give the same speech over and over and over again, you start learning by osmosis. Later, I think in the 90s, I was at DC, and DC had a policy of like, well, once you earned a certain status as an editor or a group editor, then you got your own office, and your assistant sat in a different room. The assistants sat in they would share an office with other assistants or in a pool. And I thought that was a terrible idea. You need to have the assistants sit with the editor because you learn so much just by the guys on the phone talking to talent. and they're having creative discussions on the phone, and just by overhearing a lot of this stuff from Larry, I would absorb a lot of this stuff sort of, by osmosis. So when Crazy went away and they gave us Conan, I was going to leave.
Oh,
I
yeah?
think Larry talked me into staying. I was like, well, my work is done here, because Crazy was just, Dan, I got to come to work all day and tell jokes and do stupid stuff, and then and watch Larry take a mound of clay and mold it into a giant rat. He created this like 10-inch rat out of clay, and then he got out a camera and he shot this what we call fumetti, which was like a comic book with pictures,
Yeah.
and he animated the rat, and all this other stuff. I'm going. He was endlessly, and still is. I'm sorry, I hate to talk. I should stop talking about people in the past tense. He is endlessly creative. Larry Hama's endlessly creative. And I got to just just drink a lot of that stuff in. So when we went to Conan, I had no interest in Conan. Conan is, now we have to take it very, why so serious, by
Yeah.
Crom, and I'm like, oh, geez. But Larry, he said, look, Jim, leave if that's what you want to do, but you have, in this life, you learn to love what you do. And you don't always have a choice in the matter. So this is what they handed us, and let's find the joy in it, and let's, so he talked me into sticking around. And that was my introduction into the Hyborian age, and all that stuff. And I eventually succeeded Michael Fleischer as the writer on the Conan monthly book, and I was terrible at it. And the thing is, that whole run on Conan and King Conan and Baby Conan, I wrote a lot of Conan and Savage Sword of Conan. It's been reprinted a bunch of times. Dark Horse did reprinted the whole series. Marvel just put out a couple of omnibuses. I think the license is over at Titan now. And I go, why? And the thing is, the omnibuses, they sold really well. I went, why is the omnibuses selling? Dark Horse just reprinted all this stuff, but yet, and I just go, wow, so, at the moment, I have Dynamite Entertainment has recruited me to work on Red Sonja. So I'm doing this series called Sonja Reborn. It launches in August, so there's a plug for that series there. So it's me revisiting the Hyborian age, and hopefully it's my apology tour for all those bad Conan stories I wrote, like when I didn't know what I was doing.
Well, I know that you did what I forget the issue, but you wrote the one Conan book that had the when they did those 25th anniversary covers.
Right.
Yeah. It took me a long time to complete the set of all those anniversary covers.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
Because those Star Comics, man, you know how long it took me to get an affordable copy of Muppet Babies?
Oh my gosh. What about Spider Ham? Did you get?
Yeah, Spider Ham wasn't too bad to find. The rough ones was it was Muppet Babies, and what was that was the toughest one to find a good price on. But yeah, Heathcliff, yeah, Care Bears, that was the other one that was a pain to find.
Well, we almost had a Michael Jackson star comic. I was talking to, I reached out to someone who represented him that was in New York. I don't know if that was directly his agent or it was someone from the record company, but there was somebody I was talking to that actually was plugged into Michael Jackson. And this was probably right around the time, I think Thriller might have been released or was on the verging release, but I think the brothers were about to go off on their victory tour. I believe that's what they were gearing up for. And I wanted to do this Michael Jackson comic. And I talked to Michael Golden, and Michael Golden wanted to do it. So I was going to write it and Michael was going to draw it, and we pitched it to them and they loved the idea, because we didn't know at the time that Michael Jackson was trying to buy Marvel. I had no idea about that. So Michael was all into it, I never spoke to Michael. So just disclaimer. And for all I know, this guy I'm talking to could have been a complete fraud, but I think he had credentials. He was the real thing, and I and I took it to the bosses, And again, I'm going to not mention names because everybody wants to be the hero of their own story. So somebody will come along later and go, "No, that's not how it happened. Here's how it really
Yeah.
happened." So wait for them to tell you how it really happened. But I took it to Marvel, okay, to people who are important who wear suits and ties at Marvel, and said, "Look, Jackson, they're going on this tour. Want to do this comic book." But Michael Gold and I, we were going to do it straight. We were going to do a straight Marvel comic, and include lyrics from his songs and dancing is his superpower or whatever the hell, that kind of thing. But it was going to be great. And this is before he was he was big, but he wasn't as big as he became, But the people that we were talking to at Marvel, the unnamed suits at Marvel, they were like, Michael Jackson, he's that little kid with the afro, right? They had no idea who Michael Jackson was.
Oh my God.
Okay, so the word I got back was like, well, maybe we could do it as a star comic. It could be like kind of a Richie Rich thing. And I go, Michael Jackson doesn't want to be Richie Rich. He wants to be Batman.
Yeah.
But that just got all messed up and it went away. So I turned all that contact information over to them. And then next thing I knew, it just didn't happen. But you almost got a Michael Jackson comic out of it.
Man. I saw one of the things that you wrote, I guess early on that you wrote was, I got up here, the Falcon miniseries.
Yep.
Was that something that you had the idea for and went to Marvel, or was it something that they were doing and they, came to you and said, "Hey, we want you to write this," or was it kind of somewhere in between?
Neither one. It was in those days, Jim Shooter had a number of people, young writers, that he was coaching and trying to bring along. So he would assign us what were called inventory stories. And inventory stories were basically, he would hire us to write stories that Marvel probably would never print. That they would just kind of and they would take our awful scripts and give them to artists as tryouts. And then they would take all this stuff and they collect all this stuff and eventually, at the end of the fiscal year or whatever, they would assemble it into these 80-page giants and release them at Walmart or Walgreens or something like that. It was a training exercise. So I did a number of these things. I did a 2-part Iron Man story, and I did a Captain America thing. I did a Daredevil story that was Dan Jurgens' first work for Marvel. He was Daniel Jurgens by Daniel Jurgens and Jim Owsley. It was a perfectly terrible Daredevil story, and they never let me write Daredevil again. But at some point, Jim, and Jim would just, I don't know, I don't think he had any particular criteria, but I had written all this other stuff, so by the time he said, "Well, why don't you go write a Falcon story?" And I went, "Okay, I'll write a Falcon story." So it wasn't like he said, "Oh, you're black, write a Falcon story." It's like, no, I'd already I already did a Spider-Man story and an Iron Man story and a Daredevil and some, other stuff, a Hulk story. I've done all kind of stuff. By the time he said, go do this Falcon story. So I went and I did this perfectly awful, Falcon story. And they gave it to some new guy that they were trying out, this guy named Paul Smith. And the work comes back from Paul Smith and it's absolutely phenomenal.
Yeah.
Absolutely beautiful work, and then Jim has copies made and he distributes copies of this work to every editor. And he's just raving about this book. Like, we need to look into this. We need to look into that. Now, the thing is, they made copies of the pencils, but the book had not been lettered. So you couldn't read the words on the book. So Paul got snapped up almost immediately, I think, by the X-Men office or some of that ilk. But he got gobbled up almost immediately, and he's off to the races, But the guy who wrote the story, nothing, because the book was not lettered, So I'm like, wow, always a bridesmaid. But yeah, that's how that came about. So once Paul got snapped up by the X-Men people or whoever, Shooter came back to me and said, I got an idea. Instead of just polybagging this and shipping it off to Walmart, why don't we just make a miniseries out of it? So give me 3 more parts, and we'll try it out on some new guy named Mark Bright. And that's how I met Mark Bright, and Mark started drawing the Falcon, and the rest is history.
Yeah, that's what that was going to be a question. I was wondering how come, Paul Smith did the first issue and Mark Bright did the other 3. So it's interesting.
Gobble.
Yeah.
Gobble gobble. Yeah, the X-Men people, they were good for that. If you were good, gobble gobble.
I know that that they would have all of these backlog stories, and that's what eventually kind of became a lot of the stuff they put in Marvel Fanfare when they started
Right.
doing that.
Yes. Marvel Fanfare, Marvel Winter Special,
Yeah.
Marvel Special 80-page, bag of crap. Yeah.
Marvel's way to part you with $5 of your money.
And unfortunately, there is no budget for Marvel to buy up inventory like that, which is a
Hmm.
shame because it was important training. It
Yeah.
was Shooter earned his reputation for being a taskmaster. Writing for Shooter was uh, unpleasant to say the least.
Hmm.
15 drafts of the Captain America graphic novel, and that never got published. And he was just impossible to please. And I thought, well, the guy's just deranged or something. Now, Dan, 30 years later, I look back on that work and I realize how bad it was. The problem is, at the time, you don't realize how bad you are because you think you're great.
Yeah.
It's a weird psychosis that goes on where in order for you to tell the difference between a good story and a bad story, you have to be a really good writer so that you can apply a set of objective principles
Hmm.
to the work that you're looking at and review it objectively, which you can't do if you're the person who wrote it. You It's your baby, you gave birth to it, you think it's wonderful. I
Yeah.
can't read most of my stuff from those days because it's just that bad. You know, uh, even the Black Panther stuff, I just cringe every time I read that. I go, "What the hell was I thinking?" You know, so I just feel like, I feel like I have a much better command of craft, but I guess that's what happens when you practice your craft every day of your life for 45 years. Either you get better at it or there's something really wrong with you,
Yeah.
So that's kinda how that went.
And I was thinking, oh, in the mid '80s, I saw that you worked on the Spider-Man titles. You were editing them. You were writing some of them.
Yep.
I mean, Spider-Man's, that's Marvel's top character. What was it? What was it like working on that and kind of overseeing all the books? Because by the mid, how many did he have by the mid '80s? Was it three
It
at
was
that point?
3, yeah, 3 plus Marvel Tales, right?
Amazing, Spectacular, and Web of.
Yeah. And yeah, that and Marvel Tales, and then of course the annuals and so forth. Now, when I got promoted to editor, finally, because they promoted everybody, well, Jim just ran out of people to promote before he finally said, "All right, we'll let Owsley, be an editor." So when I finally got promoted, we had an editorial meeting. Whenever someone got promoted, okay, so here's Mike Carlin. Mike Carlin is now an editor. Yay, Mike Carlin! So we'd have this editorial meeting, and it'd be a book shuffle, where Shooter would shuffle the books around. He thought it was a good practice, and I agree, a good practice to move the books around every now and then because you get stale on a book after a while. You do.
Mhm.
You've been editing, Banana Man for 20 years. It's time to get some fresh blood in there.
Yeah.
All right, so I got promoted, so now I'm having my bar mitzvah. I'm up there, right, in the editorial meeting. Okay, Jim just got promoted, yeah, 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 whatever. Uh, and usually the new editor got all the goofy books. They got Disco Dazzler, and actually at the time Transformers was a goofy book to get. So
Hmm.
I figured that I would get saddled with like all of that kind of stuff. But at this particular meeting, Jim said, okay, because the Spider-Man editor, was leaving. That was Danny Fingeroth, and he was going on to be the writer, I think, of Web of Spider-Man. Okay, so who wants to take over the Spider-Man books, and we'll give all the Dreg stuff to Owsley? And nobody wanted Spider-Man. In
Wow.
those days, Spider-Man wasn't selling very well, and this is way before McFarlane.
Hmm.
It wasn't a very attractive gig, and nobody wanted it. And Jim couldn't get anybody to budge, and he didn't want to force people to take it. So I assume, and again, when you talk to Jim, he will have a different version of this story, and he'll probably be more correct because I want to be the hero of my story. Um, but Jim said, I would imagine Jim thought, well, we'll let Owsley take on the Spider-Man franchise. Why? Because the people who were writing the 3 books at the time, all of them were well-established editors. Tom DeFalco was the executive editor of Marvel Comics, a great teacher. He was a close friend. He will take me by the hand. He will, shepherd me along. Weezy Simonson, I believe, was writing Web of Spider-Man. Danny was going to take over from her at some point. And then Peter Parker was being written by Al Milgrom, who was another editor, there on staff there. So there was all this experience that were on the Spider-Man books. So I would guess the thought might have been, well, there's real solid people in place. They will hold Jim's hand and everything will be safe. And in the history of the world, was there never a man more wrong? It was an interesting ride, because I'd go into Jim's office and close the door, and then all of a sudden Jim would be Darth Vader, make the books better. You have to fix this. Jim Owsley, you are my son. So I became under a lot of pressure. Jim Shooter was a guy who wanted to make comics better and have them come out on time, which are diametrically opposed goals. Okay. So you can make them better. You can make them come out on time. You can get them to come in under budget. Now pick 2.
Yeah.
Okay. That's all you can do. Now at the time I was 17. No, I was 21 by the time I got Spider-Man. So I was 21 or 22 or whenever it was. I was the most junior person on the editorial team. Jim Shooter was God. So here's Galactus, Jim Shooter, and me way at the bottom of the food chain. Okay, so what are you going to do? So you just go, all right, and you try to work within these confines where I was in this headlock and I was under a lot of pressure to improve the books and to kind of reshape the books, and I moved the books creatively to a place where I wanted the 3 books to have specific reasons to exist. So Amazing Spider-Man was our classic Spider-Man. That's Tom DeFalco's book. Tom was the head writer. We're all following Tom's lead. Tom was doing a fabulous job with Ron Frenz. We're not touching that. Okay. Peter Parker, I decided let's move that book more toward like the older age range, people who have maybe outgrown, the classic Spider-Man and are ready for something different. So, Spider-Man wore the black suit in Peter Parker and he wore the classic suit in Amazing Spider-Man. Amazing Spider-Man took place during the day. Peter Parker took place at night. We brought on Rich Buckler and a new kid named Peter David. And Peter came on and completely understood the mission because Peter started writing the Marvel Spider-Man equivalent of, I don't know, Deadwood, or of an HBO, one of those HBO shows. It was very grown up. There was many a time that Peter and I both thought we were going to be fired. The Sin Eater comes in and he fires a double barrel shotgun blast at Betty Brant, and blows a hole right through the chair that she's sitting in, to be continued. And Peter and I were both, neither one of us drink, but if we did, we'd be getting drunk that night. So after hours, I'm going, I don't know. I think we went too far this time because it was like back in those days, you didn't do stuff like that. And Buckler did such a wonderful job. The artist just did an amazing job with it. And then for Web of Spider-Man, I wanted that to be our fish out of water a story where Spider-Man goes out of town freelancing for J. Jonah Jameson's magazine. I forgot the name of it, but he's going to different countries, different towns, stuff like that. So it's kind of like, Peter wrote this story once about the commuter cometh, where he sends Spider-Man to Scarsdale, and there's no skyscrapers for him to swing from. And none of his usual shtick works because he's got to hitch rides on top of trucks and, try to figure out what he's, how to navigate around and how to be Spider-Man when you're not in Midtown Manhattan, so that's what Web was about, so there was a lot of chair shuffling. And then I met this guy, Mark Beecham, and Mark comes in, and now Mark is inspiring this whole other take on it because he's very Neil Adams-y, very Bill Sienkiewicz-y, and he's bringing that vibe to a lot of what he's doing. And it was some exciting stuff, some really creative stuff, but it caused a lot of turmoil because anytime you start making creative changes, people are so closely identified with the thing they do, with the art that they do, that it's impossible for them to not take creative decisions personally,
Yeah.
and feel personally attacked or personally affronted in some way. So there was a lot of unfortunate stuff going on there. And maybe they shouldn't have given me the Spider-Man books, or worse, if you give me the Spider-Man books and you put all this experienced talent on the books, then just let them do whatever they do.
Yeah.
But having me come in and have to kind of like, now there's a new sheriff in town, we need to make all these changes. Wow, Dan, it was a rough time. Let's put it that way.
So one thing I wanted to ask too is if you can just talk about kind of what an editor does, because I think everyone, comic fans know, all right, the guy that writes it, the draw,
Right.
penciler, inker, colors, they letter, they know all that, but like I don't know that everybody really knows exactly what an editor is. Maybe they think, oh well, he gets the scripts and checks them for spelling or continuity errors or whatever. But like
Right.
I know there's so much that goes into it. Could you kind of talk about what would go into editing a book, or like like a line of books like that?
Yeah, sure. There's a proofreader who checks,
Yeah.
grammar and spelling, and there's an assistant editor who will go look up, well, when's the last time the hobgoblin grew a mustache,
Hmm.
and they do all that kind of homework. The editor is like a showrunner on a TV show.
Hmm.
Um, I was lobbying heavily and laughed at mightily in the 80s. I was lobbying heavily for DC. I think I was at DC at the time, to stop calling the editors and start calling them producers, because that's what we do. We're producers. We're not editors.
Hmm.
Editor is you submit a manuscript and the editor helps you shape your story into whatever. Okay. With comics, you are handed a franchise. Hello, Dan. You are now the editor of Thor. So Thor is now your responsibility, and you're in
Yeah.
charge of all things Thor, and you have to maintain that franchise. And you will be responsible for hiring the talent, supervising the talent, getting, developing the production schedule, getting the things, out on time. That's what a producer does.
Hmm.
That's what you're essentially the head writer, of the TV show or of the comic book in this case, and that's really what an editor does. It's a bad title. It's always been a bad title.
Hmm.
There's so much more. Editing is the smallest part of what they do.
Yeah.
Are a lot of times guidance counselors. They are calling the talent and talking them through, their insecurity or their family problems or their money problems or whatever's going on, because they're trying to get them to turn the work in. They're trying to get
Yeah.
them to suit up. There's been many times when, like, there was, Tom and I, we were, I wouldn't say I was having a conflict with Ron Friends, but there was some kind of misunderstanding or whatever.
Some tension there.
Because I was stupid. Whatever it was, it's completely my fault. But Tom and I got on a plane, flew out to Pittsburgh, grabbed up Ron Friends, and we took Ron Friends to a couple of strip clubs. Okay, that's what an editor does. Okay, you go and you do talent relations, and and you have creative meetings and your retreats or whatever the story is. This is but editing is the smallest part of it.
I'm gonna remember that. And anytime I hear anybody talking, they say, "What does an editor do?" I'm going like, an editor gets on a plane and goes to Pittsburgh and takes the artist from Amazing Spider-Man to multiple strip clubs.
Yes, yes, that was fun. Yes, that was totally fun.
And around this time too, you were writing the Power Man and Iron Fist book that you had a pretty good run on. What was it like writing that duo? Who, I mean, they couldn't, character wise for backgrounds and what they do couldn't be more opposite. Yet, so many people in comics look at them as one of the best duos, like one of the best friendships in comics. So, what was it like writing that book?
Well, it was kind of terrifying because I thought Joe Duffy did a much better job, and we're following. I think Kurt Busiek took it over briefly, or whoever was, between Joe Duffy and myself.
Hmm.
But Joe Duffy and Kerry Gamble, that was to me the definitive Power Man and Iron Fist run. So when Mark and I took it over, it was kind of by fiat. Jim took me down the hall, walked me into Denny's office, pointed to me, and said, "This is your new Power Man Iron Fist writer," which did not make Denny happy at all. And so Danny and I started out on a really rough situation because Denny didn't want me there. Denny didn't know who I was, and Denny didn't want me there. And I worshipped the ground Denny walked on. I was a Denny O'Neil fan from long ago, from Green Lantern, Green Arrow, and way back then. I mean, he was like the first writer, I think, that I really was able to go to lock in on and go, I know this guy's work, and I would just pick up anything that had his name on it. So to be rejected by Denny and to be in this situation where Denny just was resentful that I was there, that was very difficult for me. That was very hurtful for me. I mean, he wasn't mean to me, but I could tell it was like, no editor likes the boss to come in and force talent on them. So I completely understand that. But we did a couple issues together, and I think at some point, and again, this is just me again being the hero of my own story, but I think at some point he started to see some value or some credibility to my writing, to my work, and the more he began to work with me, the better I'd get, and the better I get at it. And then the book started to really kind of gel together. And, and Mark and I, obviously, we had a really great relationship. "Oh, Jim, that's just stupid." That was pretty much his reaction to every script I turned, Mark's reaction to every script I turned in. And everything was pretty great until Jim began to launch the new universe and needed to clear out some room on the schedule. So a bunch of books were getting canceled. We got canceled. We were selling 250,000 copies a month when we got canceled, because in those days, that was pretty weak. That was borderline. They were getting ready to chop Captain America. And I think, Mark Grunewald was either the editor or the writer at the time. And I think that, he lay down on the railroad tracks and he was like, you can't cancel Captain America. They'll never forgive you. You cancel Captain America to put out, Bubba Man or whatever in the new universe. The fans are not dumb. I don't know if comic book publishers understand that comic book fans, they're not stupid. They know you moved this book out to make room for this new thing. You want them to appreciate and welcome the new thing and not resent the new thing because you canceled their favorite book. So when they canceled Power Man and Iron Fist, it upset Denny quite a bit because now me and him are buddies. You understand? Now he's really feeling the book and he thinks we're doing really good work, and the sales are strong. And what are you doing canceling this book? So he was very upset about it, and he ordered the death of Iron Fist.
That's what was going to be my next question, whether that was, whether your choice or whether Marvel was like, get rid of him or what.
No, Denny put out two hits that I get blamed for. One was Iron Fist, the other was Cat Matui over at DC in Action Comics Weekly. So he said, okay, I think that Iron Fist gets killed and Luke gets blamed for it, and he goes on the run, and that's how we end the series. And I was like, gee, I don't know if we should do that, and I wasn't really comfortable with it. And Denny essentially said, well, I appreciate that and I respect that, but this is what we're going to do, and either you'll do it or I'll have to get somebody else to do it. And I didn't want someone to come in at issue 125 at my final issue and slot in there. So I crafted a story that I thought accomplished what he wanted to accomplish, but did it in a way that was respectful to the characters and poignant in a way where this innocent kid ends up accidentally. He doesn't mean to kill Iron Fist. He just accidentally kills Iron Fist, and then years later, I get this call from John Byrne, and John Byrne is like, hey, listen, I wanted to run this thing by you. And he has this plan to bring Iron Fist back, right? And prove that the Iron Fist that got killed was a Skrull, or I forgot what his plan was. but he's being very deferential and very respectful, which is cracked me up because he's John Byrne. You understand?
Yeah.
He's John Byrne. I'm nothing. You're John Byrne. I'm nothing. But that's how he treated me with such respect. And I laughed and I said, John, I don't write Iron Fist anymore. Okay, it's comics. By all means, please bring him back. I didn't want to kill him in the first place. So that was the happy end of that story, was that John Byrne went in and solved the problem. And just parenthetically, I was writing Action Comics Weekly. Denny O'Neil had moved on to DC. He brought me over to DC after my stint at Marvel. I was writing the Green Lantern slot in Action Comics Weekly, which was a whole nother conversation, with Gil Kane. How blessed was I to get to work with Gil Kane? And my first story was kind of dictated by Denny, and Denny wanted Star Sapphire to brutally kill Kat Matui, the kind of pinkish purple Green Lantern.
Mm-hmm.
And to this day, I run into people at shows and they're like, "You bastard, you killed Kat Matui." I didn't kill Kat Matui. Denny O'Neil. I barely knew who Kat Matui was. I walked through the door. He said, "This is what we're doing." Oh, okay. So there you go.
That was actually going to be where I went next. Is you going to DC to do the Green Lantern stories in Action Comics Weekly. So that's what. So you said Denny went over to DC and brought you with him. What was it like working with writing Green Lantern when for Denny O'Neil, who had one of if not the most iconic on Green Lantern.
Yeah. Well, nerve-wracking, except that I would actually go over to Denny's place on the weekends, and he and I would walk around Thompson Square Park and plot the book together, because we were under such pressure to turn around a story every single week.
Yeah.
So he was very hands-on. He made himself really available. Now I went over to DC to do a miniseries called The Unknown Soldier. I was probably still writing Conan at the time. I was still working for Marvel, but I wasn't on staff anymore. And I think I had quit Spider-Man because a lot of my Spider-Man stuff, it started becoming like an uphill climb to write Spider-Man, because I had a very different vision of what I thought Spider-Man should be. And I had a very different approach to the thing. So a lot of my stories were being rewritten, or I was being pressured to rewrite it, and I said, okay, this is, you guys don't want me here. You clearly don't want me writing Spider-Man. So let me just move on. And at some point I spoke to Denny over at DC, and he had me come over and do Unknown Soldier. And while I was writing Unknown Soldier, they launched the Action Comics Weekly slot, and he offered me the Green Lantern 8 weekly pages, which was a nightmare. Well, it was hard for me. It was almost impossible for Mark to do those 8 pages, come rain or shine. No matter what's going on in your life, you got to churn out those 8 pages every week. So that was a real stretch, and we were both kind of glad when that book bit the dust.
What I mentioned, because I've tried writing like that before, where it's a very limited amount of pages, and it's and it's not just, oh well, it's part of a larger story, but you can't just write it like, here's the first 8 pages and then next. It's like you have to write it where there's the beginning, a good beginning for the page, for it, a good ending for it, that that's like a kind of cliffhanger thing, like, and then tell the good story in between. Like that's tough for a very limited amount of pages.
It is. And what I've tried to explain to people is that it takes me almost as long to write like a 8-page, story as it does for me to write a 20-page story. So I tend to start turning down real short pieces like that, particularly if it's like, okay, we want you to come in and do this short piece on Harley Quinn. Okay, I know who Harley Quinn is. I've never written Harley Quinn. So it's a character I'm unfamiliar with, which means now I have to do all this research and try to get inside the character's head and try to find my angle on Harley Quinn, just to do these 5-page stories that, so the economics of it becomes very expensive. Obviously, the longer it takes you to do something, Dan, the more expensive it is for you to do it.
Yeah.
So me doing this 5-page Harley Quinn story is going to cost me a fortune, and I can't afford it. I'm not a rich guy. I got to see the man every month, just like everybody else, and I got to keep it moving. And lately, I've said yes to too much. When you're a freelancer, you have there. It's like being an actor. If you're an actor, there is unemployment. There's unemployment, and there is overcommitment, and somewhere in between is where most writers and artists and actors and singers is where they live, somewhere between unemployment and overcommitment. And when you start leaning in toward overcommitment, then you're like, okay, I've said yes to too many things because like I realized I'm not sleeping. That I was, I went to bed at 6 o'clock this morning because I was up all night, writing a script, and I'm getting too old for that sort of thing.
Yeah.
But I wanted to turn the script in today. My goal, Dan, is to get it off of my desk and onto my editor's desk.
Yeah.
Make it his problem. So that's a real, that's a goal for me.
Well, at DC, one of the other Green Lantern things I saw you did was there was that Emerald Dawn miniseries, and you wrote the first issue of it, and it was Keith Giffen and Gerard Jones wrote the rest of the series. Was it always the plan that you were just going to do the first issue, or did anything happen that kind of threw a monkey wrench in that?
Well, yeah, no, there was a bunch of monkey wrenches, but basically, the book started out with Denny O'Neil, and Denny O'Neil was sort of given a green light to do a soft reboot on Green Lantern. And Denny and I, the thing that we have in common, or the thing that I admire about Denny's work is that Denny tends to lean toward verisimilitude. So a lot of his comics, even if they had the red tornado in it, it would be a very grounded red tornado. It'd be like, a Zack Snyder red tornado that you could take seriously, that you could reach out and touch. And then when Neil Adams drew something, like Neil Adams could draw, Metamorpho or Hawkman. Yeah. And a lot of people, struggle with Hawkman. Like only Joe Kubert could draw Hawkman. But when Neil would draw a character, I'd go, that's what the character looks like. Because Neil would sit there and he'd really kind of figure it out logically. And if this character really was sitting in the room, how would the light interact with, how would the cloak fold over Batman? These types of things. So I wanted to, and still want my writing to be just like that. That when I write a character, that gosh darn it, that's the definitive, that I'm taking Superman incredibly literally, and incredibly seriously. And that's how Denny and I approached Green Lantern when we were doing Emerald Dawn. Denny gave me Cosmos by Carl Sagan. And again, we're walking around Thompson Square Park and we're eating tofu. He was a tofu guy, and he's talking me through, he wants real science and he wants to really think about how all this stuff works. So I'm working up the Emerald Dawn thing like that, and we're really vibing and we're putting this thing on its feet. And then there was the Office War, because before Action Comics Weekly, an editor named Andy Helfer was the Green Lantern editor. So he was in charge of the franchise. So he figured after Action Comics, he'd get his character back. So he heard about this Emerald Dawn thing and he wasn't happy about it. So he went to Dick Giordano, who was the boss in those days, and Dick got, Denny and Andy in a room, and he's trying to figure out how to slice the baby in half. But at the end of the day, Andy won, and he leaves the office, and Dick's office, and Andy is now the editor of Emerald Dawn. Now the difference between Andy and Denny is that Denny is a Carl Sagan Cosmos guy, who wants this verisimilitude and he wants the Neil Adams realism. Andy, it's Aladdin's lamp. It's magic. Make a giant boxing glove.
Yeah.
I'm not making a giant. You've never seen. Go back. Go look as hard as you want. at my Green Lantern stories. You never saw Mark Wright draw a giant boxing glove or anything like silly like that. He refused to do it. He said, "I'm not doing it." He was flat out like, "No, Green Lantern. He shoots zap beams and he does, some things like that. But we're not doing the silliness. We're not doing that stuff." You know, and then in my opinion, and just to get me in real hot water with DC, um, I think there is only one Green Lantern. I think the Green Lantern is Hal Jordan.
Hmm.
I think all those other people are part of his supporting cast, and I think that that's what John Broome and these folks, that's what they had in mind with with Green Lantern. That it's a story about Hal Jordan, and then the Green Lantern Corps. That's part of the chorus. That's part of the supporting cast, whatever. But over the years, Dan, it's like people either could not write Hal credibly, or they found him boring. And I don't think he's boring. I think you're just not applying yourself. He's
Yeah.
not an easy character to write because he's not Oliver Queen. Oliver Queen he's got all that personality and that attitude,
Hmm.
right? And Hal Jordan doesn't have that. Barry Allen doesn't have that. So what do? They get rid of these characters. There's nothing wrong with these characters. You just have to understand how to write them and how to make these characters interesting. Particularly if you just have them bounce off of Ollie for 22 pages, that's perfect.
Yeah.
But at any rate, over the years, Hal Jordan has become just another Green Lantern, because it's easier to write the pig guy or to
Mhm.
write the Tom Array, the bird guy, or to write Cat Matui, or to write, John Stewart, or write who's the angry guy, Guy Gardner.
Guy Gardner. Yeah.
Because Guy Gardner, that's sexy. He's got a sexy speech pattern and he's got a hair trigger temper. That's much easier to write. It's easier to write those guys than to write Hal Jordan. So Hal Jordan kept getting pushed farther and farther and farther into the noise, to the point where, they renamed the book Green Lanterns, plural.
Yeah.
Okay, look, you're destroying your character,
Hmm.
by just kind of like, and now you got the yellow lanterns and the purple lanterns and the polka dot lanterns and all this other nonsense going on here. And where's Hal? And Hal is just somewhere lost in all that noise. Hal Jordan is Green Lantern.
Hmm.
You don't have to turn him into Parallax or whatever that guy's name was. You don't have to make him a villain. You don't have to cut off his hand and give him a hook. You don't have to gouge his eye out, to make him interesting. You just have to apply yourself. And I think that that goes back to what I was saying earlier about editors and writers staying too long on a character, where they just kind of burn out on the character, but they don't want to let go.
Yeah.
Um, and they've run out of ideas 10 or 12 years ago, but they're still hanging in there. And so we got Hal Jordan being lost somewhere in the chorus line, which I think is just personally, that's just not how I would do it. If I ever get the power, Dan, I would go in and say, okay, there is no other Green Lantern than Hal Jordan, and you
Mhm.
guys have to learn how to write him.
I think, I've said it for a while. I don't have a problem with the Green Lantern Corps. I like more when they do it like, here's the Green Lantern book with Hal, and here's the Green Lantern Corps book with
Yeah,
all these other guys doing the space stuff. But
yeah,
I've always thought there's too many Earth Green Lanterns. Like,
yeah.
yeah, okay, we're on Earth and whatever, but why is Earth the only planet that has like 9 Green Lanterns at any given time? Like, we don't need that many from one planet at the same time.
Absolutely, But I think that these are terrific characters that will endure the test of time,
Hmm.
and it's just really a matter of uh, finding. There is new stuff to do. There's always new stuff to do and new places to go. Writing Superman was terrifying. What the heck am I going to do with Superman?
Yeah.
But I think we found some interesting. There was still interesting bandwidth available for Clark Kent,
Hmm.
and to have Clark Kent fixing a toaster for 6 issues was a lot of fun. So this is what I'm talking about. That it just you know, writing is hard. It's supposed to be. It's hard.
Yeah.
But go find the interesting thing about these characters, because they're wonderful, rich characters with a rich legacy. And if you can't figure out anything, call Tom King,
Hmm.
because Tom King will take something like Human Target, a character we haven't thought about ever, you
Yeah.
know, and he does a spectacular job. Or Mr. Miracle, who's been languishing forever,
Hmm.
and nobody had any interest in Mr. Miracle. I don't even know how Tom talked them into doing it, and he does this spectacular, riveting series with Mr. Miracle. There really are no bad characters per se. I think
Hmm.
we just have to kind of, apply ourselves better and bring in uh, some new ideas from outside the genre as opposed to just doing the same comic over and over again.
Yeah. Well, one thing that that was a pretty major thing in comics that you were part of was helping launch Milestone Comics. Um, which, I mean, that I remember when that happened, like that was a big deal. And how was it that how what led to the creation of that, with all of those creators coming together to launch this whole new line of original books?
Well, it started with Dennis Cowan. It was Dennis Cowan's brainchild, and he called this meeting and he called a bunch of us up, and we all met in Michael Davis's kitchen in New Jersey,
Hmm.
and he started pitching this idea, and I just thought he was crazy. I thought this is going to be a huge waste of time. Nobody's actually going to print this, but okay, all right, I'll humor him, and we all kind of put our heads together and kind of put these core characters together, and we worked together for about 18 months of intensive. It was the hardest work I've ever done in my life because I was driving a bus at the time, working at DC full time as an editor. So I would drive the bus in the morning into the city, park the bus at Port Authority, come to DC, be an editor all day, and then I'd pick up the bus and drive the bus back to New Jersey. Uh, and then I'd be working on this stuff at night, and all this stuff. And it went on for quite a while. None of us are with the women that we were with when we were doing Milestone. I think Milestone. I wouldn't blame Milestone on it, but it certainly took a personal toll because you can't just like ignore your wife for 18 months.
Yeah.
You can't just abandon your family for 18 months, and that's kind of what it took for us to figure this out. And because we're not just doing the building the characters or whatever. We're also doing the like Derek Dingle is doing the numbers, and we're
Hmm.
learning the P&Ls, and we're learning the publishing end of it. We're doing all this stuff in conjunction with Paul Levis, and Paul was not making it easy on us because we had to learn how to run a business. DC was going to bankroll us to a certain extent, but he had to be satisfied that we were not just these dilettantes who were just screwing around.
Yeah.
That we had to know how to run the business. So, but the thing about it is, Dan, the goal of Milestone was not to just publish a bunch of black characters.
Hmm.
That really wasn't what we were trying to do. What we wanted to do was create a distribution system, a distribution path into the black community because there's so much money to be made in the Latino community, in the black community. You know, there's billions of dollars, retail dollars at work in these communities. And why is there no Spanish language Spider-Man comic
Yeah.
published in America? That just makes no sense to me. Why are we not going after? I mean, why are we not trying to, ingratiate ourselves to these communities? Uh,
Hmm.
Comics as we know them, superhero comics as we know them, as traditionally been created by white males for white males.
Yeah.
So now we're becoming more diverse, and there's a lot of female creators, there's a lot of LGBTQ creators, there's a lot of different creators that are out there. But uh, uh, I think that, if you just take this diverse material and drop it into a mainstream distribution channel, you end up with mixed results. As
Hmm.
opposed to if we create we open up another vein and open up some blood flow that goes directly to, wherever you could buy double XL magazine or Vibe magazine, or if we can get into, barbershops and beauty parlors and places, where our community tends to congregate, you know,
Mhm.
put this product in front of them.
Yeah.
That creates a new audience for DC Comics. That creates, that's opening up a vein, a distribution vein. Not to challenge Diamond, or at the time it was Diamond, I think that was the distributor. We're not trying
Mhm.
to challenge Diamond. We're trying to add to and augment. Okay. So we did our part. We produced the product. Um, but I guess the marketing guys at DC never got the memo. And again, talk to somebody else, get their side of the story, because I could be getting this all wrong. I don't know. But from my desk, from where I sat, and what I observed was a lot of petty, a lot of pettiness, a lot of I felt there was a lot of rivalry between the DC editors who would see the milestone guys come through the office and kind of resent them a little bit because they were getting daddy's attention and they were getting this money, and everyone up there is competing for resources.
Oh yeah.
So there's just kind of that. And then the marketing people, besides not being the brightest bulbs in the world, and I'll take that one to court. They weren't really, these were not geniuses. These were not, I don't know what they were thinking, but I think that there was like, okay, we don't like these guys, or we don't like their attitude, so we're not going to, work on this project of opening up this new distribution system, which is stupid. Who cares whether you like us or not?
Yeah.
Your job is to sell comic books. We have comic books. Your job is to sell them. you
Yeah.
know, and instead, I felt like what DC did was they said, "Thank you very much." Milestone delivered their comics. They worked very diligently at it. They delivered these wonderful books, and DC just dumped them into the main distribution channel, which is not, and it's not to call anybody a racist, but it's a channel system that has not been developed to support this kind of product.
Yeah.
So we're going to have diminishing returns. We sold some comic books, but it's not the kind of reception that we would have gotten had we gotten into the places that we were trying to get into.
Yeah.
We weren't interested in being in Diamond. I mean, sure, let's be part of Diamond. Don't get me wrong. Diamond's
Yeah.
great. Love you, Diamond. Let's be in Diamond. But let's develop our own direct channel into this community, because
Yeah.
there is so much opportunity there that is not being taken here, and in the Latino community and in the LGBTQ space, that is not being pursued in any way, or at least not being pursued seriously.
Yeah.
Comics has traditionally been so focused on white males.
Mhm.
So that irritated the hell out of me, at the time. And I think we're doing better now in terms of the whole diversity issue, but we still have a long way to go.
Yeah. You're definitely right about that. I think, and taking that a step further just for comics as a whole, I think that the industry is losing a lot of potential readers by not having comics as widely available. When I was a kid, and I've talked to people like this before, we didn't most people didn't start off getting comics going to comic shops. We got comics at the gas station and
Right.
at the grocery store and the newsstand, and they're not available there anymore. And how many how, most parents, unless they're already into comics, are not going to take their children to out of the way to a comic book store to look
Yeah.
at something. I remember when I was a kid, I would go and look at stuff on the spinner rack while my mom was at the grocery store. Then get one or two comics. Oh, mom, get these for me on the way out, or get something at the gas station to read on a car trip. And
Yeah.
you know
I mean, most comic shops now are run by, regular folks. These are mom and pop shops. These are people who have high rents, who have small margins, and every month these people, these salt of the earth people, our retailers are so important to us, and every month they take that catalog. or these now that are several catalogs, obviously, because it's diversified now. It's not just Diamond. But every month they take these catalogs and they look at the upcoming titles, and it's like working a racing form. You're trying to figure out what to bet the mortgage on.
Yeah.
What book do you think is going to perform? Now, meanwhile, they can't afford prime space, on Main Street or on Fifth Avenue. They're in a strip mall somewhere. So the average consumer who knows nothing about comics, they've got to go hunt these people down to go find the comics. But to your point, putting comics on spinner racks now is probably prohibitively expensive, because you have to remember, back in the day, it was all printed on newsprint. It was very
Yeah.
cheap. The quality of it wasn't good. The rates they were paying like $35 a page for someone to draw a page of Batman or whatever. The rates were terrible. That was the other thing that Jim Shooter and Paul Levitz particularly, changing it so that the artists and writers made a living wage, was a big part of what they did, while people are kicking Jim in the shins. You're getting royalty checks today for stuff you did in the 80s. Thank you, Jim Shooter. In order to put comics on spinner racks, back in those days, they would overprint a bunch of stuff, and a lot of times the distributors, not the retailers, not the 7-Elevens or the candy stores, or the drug stores, wherever they end up, but the people who drove the trucks to bring them there. They'd bring them in these bundles and just drop them like newspapers. A lot of times the distributors would kind of rip you off. They would take half of the comics, rip the covers off, ship the covers back to DC for a credit, and throw the comics out, or they would sell them for like a nickel to a comic shop or to a flea market or whatever store. But there was a lot of the shenanigans going on. There was a lot of what you call what do you call that when people are stealing from stores? They call it leakage or something like that.
Yeah.
It's a leakage. So if you wanted to sell 35,000 copies, you had to be prepared to print like 50 or 60,000 and expect that 15,000 would magically disappear, right? For this stuff to end up on newsstands. But what you're talking about, Dan, was comics were at some point an impulse buy. I'm in here to get some deodorant and pick up my prescription, but I'm going to give the rack a spin, because you can't not give the rack. You know what I'm saying? Yeah. If there's a comic rack, you can't not give it a spin, dude.
Yeah.
And sometimes the good books, you gotta dig through. The good books are in the back, because some schmuck has put Archie in front.
He's put them back there so he can come back and buy them later.
Oh. Is that the trick?
I went to a comic shop the other day. Really, I went to a shop the other day that was having a dollar book sale. They had $40,000 books out, and I'm like, on my budget, that's great, for older books. Yeah. And they had signs up that said, please do not hide comics, and and somebody said, what do they mean hide comics? I'm like, it's because they're gonna take the stuff and they're gonna go like stick it, right. In the graphic novels are gonna like stick them back there. They're gonna go stick them somewhere in the store that they don't think anyone else will look at, funny. So they can come back later and get them if they're not able to get them now.
That's great. Yeah. So it's just we don't have that anymore, and that's a real shame, because that was the gateway drug. Was the spinner rack? Is that it would just become like, maybe I'll pick up a couple books while I'm here.
Yeah, that's what I would do. When we go on car rides and there'd be stop at the rest stop. And I remember Marvel and DC both used to do those little digest size ones, and I'd get some of them, or, buy some, just some issues of Spider-Man or G.I. Joe, or, or Justice League or whatever, and, have something to read in the car. And, that
I heard that they were either Marvel or DC were doing something like that again. They're not digest size, but they're manga sized comics. Have you heard anything about this?
I've seen some of them at the shop that DC's done, where they've collected like past storylines, and they're like, the small kind of volumes there. Yeah, I've seen those at the shop.
I was in Oregon. I was in city I can't remember in Oregon. I apologize. Eugene. I was in Eugene,
Yeah.
Oregon, and visiting a comic shop there. And really, they had the usual wall of superheroes, so that's always going to be there. But the it seemed like the more popular stuff it was a college town, so the most popular stuff with the college kids was manga. Manga is
Mhm.
incredibly popular,
Yeah.
and of course anime and so forth. But it's all this sort of stuff that Dark Horse is putting out, and then of course there's the Brian K. Vaughan stuff that's back there that's doing real well, and I'm like, well, you know, uh, successive generations are growing up, and they're either moving away from superheroes or they were never into superheroes to begin with. Because a lot of that, the stuff that this guy was prominently displaying that was not on the new release, superhero wall there. Um, all the stuff that was really kind of like prominently displayed, including some expensive sort of hardcovers and omnibuses and things, had nothing to do with what we do for a living.
Mhm.
So it's kind of like eye opening for me and going, maybe this is a space that we ought to be in more aggressively, because there's a great deal of interest in it.
I mean, I'm all for anything that'll get kids interested in comics again. Every year when they do new comic book day,
Hmm.
different stores have different limits on how many comics you can get. The store I go to says you can get 5 for free, and then
Hmm.
they do a can drive for the local food bank, and they say you get 5 for free. If you bring in a donation, you get
Yeah.
another 5. But then they always have a lot of extras, and they leave them sit out for a couple weeks after that. So
Yep.
I'll go back the week, a week or two after
Oh,
new.
you got it figured out already.
Well, no, I'll go on New Comic Day and do that and buy
Yeah.
something from the store. But a week or two afterwards, to make sure everybody's had time to grab stuff, I'll go in and they'll let me take, a few stacks of some things. And at Halloween, when I'm passing out candy to trick or treaters,
Oh,
I pass these comics out too. And the kids always get excited. I'm like, hey, you guys want some comics? And I'll, hold them out. And they're like, oh, yeah, yeah. I'm like, oh, what do you want? I got Spider-Man. I got Justice
wow.
League. I got Avengers. This. I'm like, oh, I want this. I'm like, hey, take 2 of them. Take 3 of them. Like, you know,
Yeah. Pass them out to your friends. Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
Gateway drug. You're awful. Yeah.
But now kids, they don't read seek the comics out as much. Now they get it through the movies, but
Right.
the movies all get it from the comics.
Yeah.
You had that fantastic long run on Black Panther. You introduced stuff like the Dora Milaje and all that, and so much stuff to the Black Panther mythos. What was it like writing that book? And then you see in the MCU that they use that in the movies, and not just, oh yeah, it's kind of mentioned they're there. Like, no, they're like major parts of it.
Yeah, but a lot of that stuff's evolved over time. So,
Hmm.
I think Brian Coogler, he did a really brilliant thing where he did an amalgam of several versions of several visions of the Black Panther.
Hmm.
The Black Panther I was writing had been king for at least 15 years. And he was this kind of, sullen, unknowable. He was Batman. I was writing Batman.
Yeah.
Because DC never lets me write Batman. So every chance I get, I'll just create my, okay, I'll do a Moon Knight story. Oh, he's Batman. And here's Black Panther. He's Marvel's Batman. You know, if Ryan Coogler had done a straight adaptation of my work, it would the movie would read more like Matt Reeves' The Batman. It would be more like that in tone, because that's closer to what I was doing
Hmm.
in Black Panther, um, and it would be less family friendly, and he would have cut out like 2/3 of his audience. With the Black Panther film, Marvel discovered an audience that they didn't know they had, because grandparents who would never set foot in a movie theater to see a superhero movie, they came to Black Panther.
Hmm.
Latinos came to see the Asian people came to see the Black Panther. You know, girls who had no interest in superheroes. Lots of urban youth who were like they're trying to represent. So they Wu Tang sort of they came to see Black Panther. even though these are not people who are necessarily comics fans or who would probably never be caught dead in a comic book shop, they came to see Black Panther. It became almost a religious obligation among African Americans to come see this film because of the integrity in which Nate Moore is the executive producer and Ryan Coogler was the director. The integrity that they injected in this thing, and of course, Mr. Boseman's amazing performance. But a lot of what you see up on the screen, the infrastructure of Wakanda, that's Don McGregor. Stan Lee and Jack Kirby, they created the character, and certainly created like, all right, he comes from this place called Wakanda and it has this kind of technology and has this kind of culture. Don McGregor is the guy who went in and said, okay, based on what Stan and Jack did, what can I, extrapolate from that and build upon that? And so he sits down, he hand draws this map of Wakanda, like Robert E. Howard's map of Hyboria, right? He hand draws this thing. And here's, where the gorilla people are up in the mountain. And here is these people down in the valley. And here's where the river is. And here's how it all comes together. This is Don McGregor. He's not getting paid for this.
Yeah.
He's writing like this backup story bi-monthly in Jungle Action of all things, and people at Marvel are just ignoring him. Just do whatever you want. And he's back there with Billy Graham creating Killmonger and all this other stuff, and then I come along and I see all this stuff, and Marvel has asked me to sort of Joe Quesada has kind of asked me to reimagine this stuff and update it, and make it more relevant, and I said, well, look, why should we throw this stuff out? If this here is gold, he's done all my work for me.
Yeah.
So all I did was just take the Don McGregor stuff and set it to a hip hop beat, just kind of like, crank it up, take it up a notch, right? But what you see on the screen, so much of that is Ta-Nehisi Coates. And so much of that is Brian Stelfreeze. Brian Stelfreeze and Ta-Nehisi, they're the ones who took Dora Milaje. My Dora Milaje, they were a religious order. They were like nuns in mini dresses and so forth. Ta-Nehisi decided to make them a warrior class and build out this sort of other idea. And then the costumes, these Oscar-winning, beautiful set designs and things. And forgive me, I forgot the name of the designer, this wonderful woman who just created all this stuff here. But she extrapolated all that from Brian Stelfreeze's original comic book art and from the thought that Brian and Ta-Nehisi brought to this thing. So their Okoye is not my character.
Yeah.
I created a character, but they evolved it into something else, just the way I evolved McGregor into something else, the way McGregor evolved Kirby into something else. So Black Panther's had a lot of fathers, and Chadwick Boseman's performance, he is not my character who has been king for 15 years. He is the prince who becomes king. So he's still learning how to do it. Okay. And he gets kind of caught off guard by this whole business with his father getting killed and then Killmonger and all this other stuff. My guy would have never fallen for any of that because he's been around the block too much, but with Boseman's Panther, he's still the new guy. He just got here, but it was very gratifying nonetheless to just see these people walking around. And here's Zuri and here's Nakia, and here's Eric K. Ross walking around, and I'll admit, I was in the theater sitting next to McGregor and we're tearing up like little girls, us, and there's, Dennis Cowan and a bunch of artists, and, Ta-Nehisi was there, and Brian, and it was wonderful. It was a real highlight of my career. Let's put it that way.
Yeah. That was an amazing movie.
Yeah.
Well, one of the first characters you wrote for Marvel when you became a writer, you revisited later when you went back to the Falcon and you wrote that Captain American Falcon series.
Yep.
What was it like writing that, going back to that character that, kind of started, or not started your writing career, it was very early in it, going back to him, so many years later?
Well, Captain America is a character that much like Hal Jordan, we were talking about Barry Allen, Superman. This is a square jaw white guy who
Mhm.
doesn't have a lot of ticks, who doesn't have,
Yeah.
a bunch of hooks like Guy Gardner or Oliver Queen, you know. So Cap becomes a very challenging character to write because he tends to sound very generic or whatever. And forming my opinions about Cap was that, let's say the Avengers are chasing the Red Skull, and the Red Skull goes zipping across Farmer Billy Bob's farm, and the Avengers end up at the property line of Billy Bob's farm, uh, and Cap goes to Billy Bob, Red Skull just went across your farm. Can we, get after him and capture him? And Billy Bob goes, "What are you, nuts? No, you can't come on my farm. No, no, forget it." And he just refuses. Now, most of the heroes are like, "Lord, the heck with that." It's exigent circumstances. We'll apologize later. Let's get the Red Skull, and
Yeah.
we'll just trespass on Billy Bob's farm. You know, Cap wouldn't do it. Cap said no. The guy said no. I respect the guy's, but the point of Cap is that, and Tom DeFalco, he's the guy who explained, the former executive editor at Marvel. He's the guy who explained it to me. He said, you know, the trick to Captain America is that Cap always finds a way.
Mhm.
So Cap would find a way. So here with Falcon, given the second bite of the apple with Falcon, the first time I wrote Falcon, I didn't know what I was doing, and I was writing him pretty generically, and it's another piece of work that I'm kind of embarrassed by. This time around, I'm going, all right, now I know who Falcon is. Okay, Falcon is, you know, uh, maybe he's Lennon to Cap's McCartney, or maybe it's the other way around. But the point is that there is this contrast. The way you write a character, a square jaw, upright character like Hal Jordan or Captain America or Clark Kent, is you put somebody next to him that has those shades of gray, that has those flavors or those compromises, or that has that sort of tone. And you get that echo coming. It's like when you're playing handball and you're hitting the ball against that wall, and you hear this echo, with the ball, boop, 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 you hear this,
Mhm.
so you start defining those characters by having these other characters with these colorful bits of business around them, and the resonance of their business bouncing off of Clark. Like I wrote a very tough Lois Lane.
Mhm.
I wrote a Lois Lane who was giving Clark Kent tough love to try to get him to snap out of his malaise and try to get her husband back. So, she was not a nice person. She was not like, "Oh, there, let me hold your hand and make you soup." No, she's like, "No, get off the floor, you know, breathe, Clark." So I'm defining him by the characters around him. So the easiest way for me to write Captain America, or just to explain who Captain America is to put somebody next to him who would not only cross Billy Bob's farm, but would probably smack Billy Bob in the head while he's doing. So it's not that Falcon or Sam Wilson. It's not that he's compromised in any way, but I had Sam Wilson. They're teaming up to accomplish some mission or whatever. And Cap is like, okay, that's the plan. I'll meet you on the other side. Yes, sir. And Cap goes off to do whatever he's doing. And then Falcon would go and do these subversive things behind Cap's back because he knows that Cap is going to do the right thing all the time, but sometimes you really need to cut corners and
Yeah.
solve the problem, and that's what Sam would do. So it was kind of like McCartney and Lennon, where McCartney would be like, today's a really great day, everything's going well, and then Lennon would come along, and go, things couldn't possibly get worse, and it would be this study of contrast that would complement each other very well. So having that team there, that diversity, I think that worked really well. And Joe Bennett and I, we had a great time doing that series. Um, and then Marvel Knights was doing their own Captain America book. And when that run ended, and there was only going to be one Captain America book, we thought that we had earned our shot, that we had done good work on
Yeah.
Captain America and the Falcon, and that we would now become the Captain America book. But instead, we got the boot, and they hired Brubaker, Ed Brubaker, and I forgot. I'm sorry, I forgot his artist name.
Is
You know,
it was Steve Epting, I think.
yeah, that sounds right. And nothing against either one of them. They did great work. They got I think they got nominated for an Eisner, and well deserved. But I thought we deserved our shot.
Yeah.
And that irritated the hell out of me. So Marvel, as a consolation prize, they launched the Crew, and they said, "Well, why don't you go do this? Here's an idea. Let's do the Crew."
It
You
did
know,
seem like your Cap and Falcon book. I remember at the time, like it seemed like it ended abruptly.
yeah, that's a nice way to put it. It ended abruptly.
Yeah.
you know. So we went on to do the Crew, and Joe Bennett and I invested a lot in the Crew. Um, uh, uh, and long story short, Marvel was launching a new initiative. So there was a group of books going out, and I forgot what this initiative was. I couldn't tell you, but it was just like, here's the new, sunflower seed books, whatever. So it's like 3, 4, 5 books, whatever they were. And they lumped us in with that marketing initiative so that we could sort of like tailgate off of whatever that launch was.
Hmm.
Now, our book had nothing whatsoever to do with the sunflower seed books or whatever they were called. I didn't even know what they were. We had nothing to do with it. Okay. And when the sales of those books were abysmal, the number ones did not perform. And retailers, they're used to this trick with this number one
Yeah.
nonsense, and they got wise that, and when we don't know what this is, so they lowballed the number ones. Marvel, I think they got cold feet on the thing, and within short order they canceled all the sunflower seed book, and they ended up canceling the Crew before issue 1 even shipped, before it even got to this anyone ever saw it.
Mm.
We were canceled. Okay, and that uh, irritated me quite a bit, and I think that's when I said, "All right, I'll have quite." Oh, you know what? I may have this backwards. The Crew may have been before Captain America and Falcon. I think we might have got Captain America and Falcon as a result of the Crew. I don't know. I'm an old man, okay? Give me a break, But at any rate, I think once Captain America went away, uh, the discussion from Marvel was, "We've got this great idea. We're going to take Captain America out of your book and relaunch it as the Falcon, and you'll get to do the Falcon. You'll have a number one and rah rah the Falcon, And I just felt like I had been demoted. I felt like, okay, this is a vote of no confidence in me, that you guys don't think that I can handle a mainstream character, a mainstream franchise character. And I thank them graciously. Great offer, and I appreciate it very much. But I would just kind of rather, I'm a little late for the unemployment line. I need to go and stand at the unemployment line. And for almost a decade, every 18 months I'd get a call. It's almost to the day. Every 18 months I'd get a call from Marvel or DC, and from some editor who was trying to get me to gain my interest in writing some character, and it was inevitably a black character.
Hmm.
And those were the days where they started casting writers instead of hiring writers. They would, okay, if we're doing a story about a kung fu lesbian, you had to be a lesbian in kung fu to write that book,
Yeah.
which is childish and stupid, But that's how they were doing it, So only women can write the women characters, and only men can write the men characters. Only the black people can write the black characters. And I was inevitably, so I went from being a writer who was writing Green Lantern and Spider Man and all that stuff, and Conan the Barbarian, and suddenly I became a black writer
Yeah.
uh, because of Black Panther, which ironically was never about the black guy. That book was about the white guy. That book was about the star of that book was Everett Ross.
Yeah.
It was about his cultural awakening and him learning, you know, him to stop being a half a racist, and learn, what black people, and more to the point, what African people are actually about. So it
Mhm.
was narrated by Ross. Ross was the focus of that story. I was writing the white guy, and yet because the book was called Black Panther, I just got typecast. So for years I just would not accept any work from people because they were only going to offer me a limited range of things, and so I was just kind of starving a lot. I was much thinner then because I couldn't afford food.
So what was it that made you decide to come back again? I know that when you came back, the book that you created with Mark Bright for Valiant, Quantum and Woody, you came back and wrote that, and then you came back and wrote a pretty long run on Deathstroke for DC.
Yeah, Quantum and Woody actually happened before the Great Depression.
Hmm.
So that was actually done, probably at the same time as the Crew or Captain America and the Falcon, and that imploded because the company went out of business.
Yeah.
Had nothing to do with us. Okay, so all the books, including
Hmm.
all the books went out of business. Um, and then I didn't work for a long time. Just sporadically, I did a thing here or there, but I really didn't work for quite a while. And uh, I was designing websites. I was doing a lot of advertising, PR work. Doing a lot of ministry. I was pastoring 2 churches. I was doing a bunch of stuff during those days, but I was broke. Well, I'm usually broke, but I was really broke then.
Yeah.
So, then I got offered Firestorm from DC, and I chatted up the editor whose name I can't remember. Great guy, whoever that was, and we had a great discussion about Firestorm. And I said, okay, well that sounds good, But tell you what, why don't you send me whatever you got on whoever Firestorm is these days, and let me take a look at it. So the next day the FedEx truck pulls up, and I get this big box of reference, and there's all these issues of Firestorm, and I crack the thing open. I look at it, and he's a little black kid.
Oh yeah, that's when it was Jason Rosh or
I
Roush.
like,
No,
so I call the guy. I go, hey, what's going on? He's black, and he goes, yeah. And I go, I can't do this. I just, don't call me if I mean, I, like anybody else, I want to write about my culture. I want to write about black people. I want to write black characters. Don't get me wrong. I have nothing against black characters, but I want to be taken seriously. I'm sorry if that makes me sound like an asshole,
yeah.
but
No, you don't want to be, you don't want to be pigeonholed into one type of thing.
I don't want anyone to be pigeonholed.
Yeah.
I don't want, any female writer to be pigeonholed like
Yeah.
that. I mean, it's terrible. Why can't a woman write Spider-Man? That's
Yeah.
ridiculous. Why can't, an Asian person write, Batman or whatever the story is? I mean, that needs to stop. So, I think it was like the following year, I got a call about Cyborg. No, thank you. Um, and then they called back. DC called back and said, "Well, how about Deathstroke?" And I said, "Is he black?" Because they were doing a bunch of race swapping back then. Remember?
Yeah.
And she said, "No," and I went, "Okay, I'm listening."
Yeah.
And our conversation started like that. But first things first. If you're going to race swap, Deathstroke, no, thank you. Please don't make me that guy.
Yeah.
And Slade was an interesting challenge. I was Marv Wolfman's intern. He was one of my first bosses back when I was a teenager. I Xeroxed so many pages of Tomb of Dracula. Let me tell you something, pal. Gene Colan, beautiful artwork, but it came off
Yeah.
in your hands, and and it was like this big magazine, so there was like 64 pages that I had to Xerox over and over and over again. Thank you, Marv Wolfman. So yeah, to get my hands on Marv's character, I was a little humbled by that, and I was like,
Yeah.
wow, and then I figured out what my take on him was. If you've ever seen the TV show House MD, the
Yeah.
Hugh Laurie show,
Oh yeah.
so you have to think of Deathstroke as House MD with a machine gun. this deeply dysfunctional person who loves and wants to be loved, but is capable of neither. So
Yeah.
he does wacky things like he puts out a hit on his own daughter so he can spend time with her, protecting her from imaginary assassins. That's how warped and twisted this guy was. So once I had my take on Deathstroke, then it just became a joy to write, became a lot of fun to write. And then all of a sudden I started reading like in the trades, like, oh, Priest is back. And it's like, oh, I never left. They were just offering me Captain Negro, every week and stuff, and I just I'm not falling for it. I'm not, uh, no,
Yeah.
and it makes some creators of color angry. I will get emails when this thing goes live.
Mhm.
I wish you stopped talking like that. And I'm like, yeah, keep wishing. I'm a writer who happens to be black. I'm proud of being black. I like being black. I've been black my whole life. You
Yeah.
know, I'll be black tomorrow. I'll be black. You know, uh, but I think it's unfair to just like all I'm asking for is a chance to compete for assignments along with everybody else. And if you don't like what I pitch, that's fine. But shutting the door and not even giving me a chance to compete seems a little silly, at this point. And uh, th- thank God most of that is going away. I mean, I blessed to say that I have been given many opportunities, probably more than I deserve, and certainly more than I have time for, to write all kinds of characters.
Mhm.
Fish guy, Birdman, and that's just great. And there's just no discussion of they offered me Black Adam. Well, Black Adam is still Egyptian.
Yeah.
All right, I'm in.
Mhm.
you
Well,
know.
you're also not a large-breasted female vampire, but you've got a pretty good long run on Vampirella, so
Yeah, and I think that that's one of those books that I feel like we've done a really solid run on. But if you know, superhero fans don't normally read Vampirella or vice versa.
Mhm.
And then there's a lot of fans of Vampirella who are collectors who kind of collect the covers but don't necessarily actually read the book that's
Yeah.
inside. So it's kind of been my crusade to get people to actually read what's inside the book, because what we're doing is not so different from what you might read in Saga or Paper Girls, which is not to say that not to put us on that level. I think Brian K. Vaughan is a genius. I love his work. I love reading those books. So I'm not doing the Pepsi challenge with him. If
Mhm.
anything, I might be doing a cheap knockoff imitation of him. But whatever you think is happening in between those Vampirella covers, it's probably not. We're writing something that is poignant and funny. It's about a single girl trying to make it on her own in the big city. She just happens to be a vampire from outer space,
Yeah.
which complicates her life. And she has this wacky mother who's always dragging her into stuff and blah blah blah. So it's a roller coaster ride from being scary to being funny to being deeply emotionally moving and then back again. But there's a lot of integrity uh, to the Vampirella series that people may not necessarily see because they form their opinion of the book the way they form their opinion of Conan. Whether you see the cover and he's slaying the monster with the sword, or you see Deathstroke. We had the same problem with Deathstroke, where DC kept putting these covers on Deathstroke with Deathstroke standing there with the bloody sword and all this stuff. And Deathstroke was not about a guy who ran around with a bloody sword. It wasn't about the world's greatest assassin. Deathstroke was about the world's worst dad.
Mhm.
Okay, it was a completely, you know, what they say, you can't judge a book by its cover, but that's exactly what people do. They look at
Oh,
the cover and
especially
they assume what's inside it. And Vampirella is such a fun book. It's such a good book. I desperately want to get more people to read it. I think you guys would really love it. There is a sampler that you can download anytime you like. It is I think it's a priest.m letter X, priest.mx / Vampy, VAMPI. I think that's how you get to it. And then there's a whole primer on Vampirella. You know, here's what it's about, so forth. It's like a 20-page sample, just pages from our run that are all kind of like, you know, bundled together in this little sampler it's called the Vampler, the VAMPLER. You know, that will let anybody who wants to read it download this thing and get a sense of what this book is, and you'll get it. I mean, she's got this wacky psychiatrist, and she's got this frenemy that complicates her life, and it's just a really fun, great book. It's got tremendous art by this guy Ergun Gündüz, who is a Turkish artist, Turkish cartoonist, I should say, and it all looks like animation cells. He does this wonderful thing with color. It's a great book. We're having a great time doing it. I love doing that book, and I just really would like, you know, more people to cross over from, you know, Green Lantern and Deathstroke and go, look, let's check out Vampirella. She doesn't have an S on her chest, and well, there's no room for one. The costume's not very big.
Yeah, the costume is, you know, it's and the costume is about, you know, not that different than how it was introduced, how many decades ago at this point?
Trina Robbins designed that costume.
Yeah.
And the thing about it is, it's like some people will have a problem with the costume because it's so revealing. You know, but I've actually seen way more revealing costumes now on YouTube, for crying out loud, on rap videos. You know, so I really think it's much less shocking than it used to be.
With what's going on in the, you know, in the industry now, I'm sure you've, like everyone's seen that Marvel and DC have decided to play nice with each other again and do another crossover with the Batman Deadpool one, which two characters that you've written. I know you've written a lot more Deadpool than you have Batman. What are your thoughts on this crossover? And I know you did one of the amalgam books when they, you know, back in the day when they did those, the JLX Unleashed book, you know, kind of what was it like working on that too? Where
well, that was easy. Well, kind of easy, because it was just, you know, I'm working with, like, I want to say Ruben Diaz. I think he was the editor, and but it, you know, it was an editor I'd known for a long time, and I was working with Mr. Jimenez, Oscar, I believe, who was drawing the book, and you know, and we're kind of off in our own little corner, and you know, we're doing our own thing. I'm not really that familiar. I just heard of Batman Deadpool. I believe it was yesterday, because
oh, okay.
I was talking to my editor at Marvel, because the idea occurred to me of doing Batman versus Black Panther,
Mm-hmm.
and I was pitching Batman versus Black Panther, and they said no, thank you. We're pulling our hair out with Batman versus Deadpool, and I don't really know what that means. You know, I hope it's a fun book. You know, I'd be curious to read it. But at the same time, I'd really like to see the Batman versus Black Panther, because of the nature of those characters. Because Black Panther's a guy who has always outwitted his opponent, and is always,
Mm-hmm.
like, you know, 5 steps ahead of his opponent. And Batman is like the world's greatest detective. So them trying to you know, smart each other, you know, in a kind of spy versus spy thing would be kind of
Yeah.
fun if I could get around doing that.
Well, you talk about Marvel, yeah. Book came out was just a couple weeks ago. The Marvel Knights: The World to Come, and you want to talk about a jaw dropper of a last page? That's, you know, kind of set the comic. You know, that book first issue set the comic world on fire
Did it
recently.
really? Really? Never
Oh
noticed.
yeah, it's
Hmm.
discussion after discussion, and all the memes now where they're like, oh, they're gonna, you know, somebody did it say, oh, Ryan Gosling's gonna play Black Panther in the MCU now, and
Well, there's an idea.
So I know at the end of the issue, it said that this was I forget exactly how it said it, but that it was an idea that you came up with a while ago and took it to Joe Quesada, and he said he wanted to draw it. So what? How did um how did this book kind of come about?
I don't know, Dan, it's been so long. I barely remember. And once again, you got to talk to Joe, and Joe will have his own version of events, whatever like that. But to the best of my recollection, um, I called Will Moss, who's an editor at Marvel, because the movie was getting ready to come out, and I had gotten a call from the executive producer Nate Moore, and Nate was picking my brains about, like, what do I think should happen in the movie, and what do you think this character would do, and so we're having a bunch of discussions with the studio people, and and it occurred to me, like, okay, this movie is going to be out next year. So I called up Will Moss at Marvel and said, look, Will, I would really like to have a Black Panther something. I don't know what, but something uh, in print, with my name on it when the movie comes out. Is there any room at the end? Do you have like a little gig or something that you can throw me? So Will was gracious enough to give me a slot in the Black Panther annual. And I did this 10 pager in the annual, this little 10-page story. You're in, you're out. Here's Ross. He's making a couple of wisecracks. Here's Black Panther doing his thing. Take a bow, done. Right? You're in, you're out. I was happy. That's all I wanted. Okay. At some point, I was talking. I think either Joe heard about it, or I forgot exactly what the sequence of events was. But all of a sudden, I was talking to Quesada, and found out that Quesada was planning to do some event for Marvel Knights' 20th anniversary. You know, um, and he was like, "Well, what if we did, something with Panther, or like a reunion thing?"
Hmm.
And I wasn't all that interested in that. I just didn't want to come back to the character and embarrass myself.
Yeah.
As it is, I read the old stuff and I just cringe a lot. It's like, what the hell was I thinking? And then, you know, uh, I've seen creators come back to the scene of the crime and
Hmm.
embarrass themselves, and I didn't want that to happen to me. So I really wasn't interested in it but we kept having discussions and pitching ideas back and forth. And it really wasn't until the thought occurred to me, and I said, well, you know what? This would be an interesting bit of business. And I can't tell you what that bit of business is without ruining the story. But it
Okay.
has nothing to do with the final page of issue one. That's
Hmm.
not the interesting bit of it. That's the least interesting thing about this series, by the way. So
That's a teaser then.
this tidal wave of attention kind of took me by surprise, because I was like, huh? What? Because
Mhm.
I've been living with this for so long. I kind of forgot.
Yeah.
And so I was like, oh yeah, yeah. Okay. But I won't spoil it for you, and I won't wade into whatever the noise is about this, except to say that, you know what, there's an issue too. You should probably read it.
Yeah.
At this point, but I will tell you that, whatever they're hollering about, you ain't seen nothing yet. Okay. Joe Casada has a twisted mind. you know, and he, his name is first because I insisted on it, because I was going to walk if they didn't put his name first, because Joe has created a monstrous tapestry of ridiculousness that is just, I mean, he's like the new Jack Kirby. I'm like, where are you coming up with this stuff? And he's taken this idea, this germ of an idea that began with us having just some discussions. And he's like, and now there's space monsters and aliens, and there's tentacles, and there's, it's this incredible story, and yes, of course I wrote it, but Joe wrote a lot of it too, and I wanted that to be reflected in how we talk about the book. That, it wasn't just like, well, Joe threw in an idea or two. No. Joe typed up reams of paper and went,
Mhm.
and then this happens, and then on the year of this, and then blah blah blah, and there's all this crap, So when the hoopla began, I was like, what? What are they yelling about? What are we talking? I'm like, is that all? I was like, you guys ain't seen nothing yet.
Well,
You this thing,
the guy
this thing is
John that
wild. It's totally freaking wild. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I was at the guy John that runs the shop I go to. When I was telling him the other day when I went there, I was like, "Oh, I'm going to be interviewing Christopher Priest." He's like, "Oh, wow, good pull." And we started talking about the issue, and he said there was somebody that came in and was, "Oh, what Black Panther's going to be white now? What is this BS and that?" And he goes, "Let me ask you something. Do you like Black Panther?" And the guy goes, "Yeah. Everything you like about Black Panther was written by this guy, so why don't you give it a chance?" He said the guy just kind of shut up, and you know, I'm looking forward to the next issue. I know you can't really tease too
I'm not even
much to
talking
come
about
because you don't want to spoil it, but
I'm
how
not talking about the next issue. I'm just saying that there is a next issue. So
Mhm,
I'm just like, I don't understand why people are kind of like, having this reaction. If I were on the other side of the counter and I was the reader and not the writer, I would be intrigued. Just like we talked about earlier about Superman walking in and his kid is turning into a gorilla. And
yeah,
I'm going, I have got to find out what happened here. You know, that's what this is. I have got to find out what the heck is going on here.
yeah,
And you know what?
yeah,
It's a story. If you keep reading it, we'll tell you. But I'm telling you, this is just the tip of the iceberg. And I am a very conventional writer in the Denny O'Neil school, maybe the Frank Miller school. I don't equate myself with either one of those gentlemen. I knew them both. I knew Denny. I know Frank. I deeply admire Alan Moore and Neil Gaiman and guys like that. So I don't think the way Walt Simonson does. And
mhm,
Walt Simonson would do like this Beta Ray Bill thing, and he'd do this enormous, like, you know, larger than life Jack Kirby thing. Uh, Joe Quesada can do it all. And Joe Quesada really, I had this much of an idea, and then Joe took it to like here,
yeah.
and beyond. And there's so much fun and amazing stuff that's yet to come in this book. We're just getting started. I'm like, wow, if they're hollering about this, they're going to be really riled up when we get to blah blah blah. So hang in there. It's fun. There's lots of fun on the way as far as
How
that goes.
many issues is it gonna be? Is it an ongoing book?
I really I probably shouldn't say. Let's put it that way.
Okay,
Okay,
fair
because I'm just going to get myself in trouble. Yeah, ask somebody at Marvel. See what they say.
Well,
Okay,
you've
I've
got
done 6 issues. Let's put it that way.
okay,
Okay, but there's discussions
mhm.
because it's
Are we gonna
Marvel's really happy with it, and I am telling you, and telling anybody that'll listen. I was like, wow, you know, the Marvel Knights characters, the Marvel Knights universe, it's still got some gas in it. Marvel should really look hard at,
yeah,
like, how far do you want to go with this? How far do you want to take this? Because, I'm telling you, Joe wrote a stack of notes like this here, that we could eat off of those stack of notes for quite a while if Marvel had the bandwidth to do it and the interest in doing it. So a lot of it's going to be up to the readers. It's one thing to get out and like do a bunch of yelling and whatever the mishigash is on. Yeah, I'm not on social media, so I don't see any of this stuff.
mhm,
But there's one thing to do all that stuff. It's another thing for it to translate into people actually going in and buying the book.
yeah,
So we'll have to see what happens. A lot of people who are doing the yelling, they never read the book. I can tell just by what they're saying. I'm going, I didn't read this book. And if you did read the book, you're not a fan of the original issues 1 through 12 of the Marvel Knights Black Panther, because
mhm,
this series is a love letter to the
yeah,
people who bought that book, who supported us when we first, me and Kevin Smith and all these other people that were working, Jimmy Palmiotti and all these other people that were working in that studio at the time. So this is all kind of a throwback to that and a love letter to that. And I think that the people who actually read the original Marvel Knights series um, have more of an insight of like, I think I know what's happening here,
mhm,
as opposed to the people who are just sort of like rage baiting over, a largely superficial thing, which I thought was like Oh, I really, honestly, Dan, I had forgotten about it, and so I was like, "What are they yelling about?" Oh, really? I don't know why I didn't see that coming, but I didn't see it coming.
It's
So
kind of like something heard when I was a kid, where somebody, some comedian said, when his dad would tell him, he'd find out one thing he did wrong, and he's like, "I'm disappointing you, son, over this." He's like, "You're disappointing me, and just over that, you're gonna be real pissed off when you find out about all the other shit that I did then."
It's exactly right. Yeah. And just by the way, just for the record, the kid's name is Katama, not Katoma or Katima. Or, I'm hearing like all these different pronunciations. And it's making my head. Think of Hakuna Katama. Yeah,
Uh-huh.
yeah, it's Katama. It's a Nigerian, it's a Ethiopian name, and it's actually inspired by an actual person
Mhm.
that I know. So there you go. But at any rate, it's a great. It's tough for me to say it's a great series because it sounds immodest. But I only co-wrote it. The stuff that I'm the most inspired by is the stuff that Joe did, and not just this gorgeous artwork. The artwork is so gorgeous, I didn't want it colored until I saw what Richard was doing. I really lobbied hard for him to not color the book. Not against Richard,
Yeah.
but I was really adamant about Joe. I said, Joe, this stuff is so beautiful in black and white and so clean. It's just amazing. And I hope that Marvel eventually will release a black and white version of this thing, because it just looks amazing. Not to put Richard down. Richard's doing a wonderful job with the color. Don't get me wrong, but just how amazing this stuff looks. Um, but it's not just Joe's art, it's that stack of paper. Now, on the other end of this, after the story is done, we'll meet back here and I can speak more freely about what's in this stack of paper.
Mhm.
But I'm telling you, Joe, wrote as much as I wrote. It was really an equal partnership. And then left to my own devices, the story would have been probably much more subdued. And Joe just took it to this whole nother completely absurd level, where I went, whoa, and we're just having a ball. We're having a barrel of laughs.
Well, you've worked, I mean, over the years, you a long, amazing career. You've worked on a ton of different characters with a ton of different fantastic creators. Are there any characters that you haven't worked on that you'd really like to take a crack at? Are there any other creators where you'd say, like, "Oh man, I'd love to do a book with this guy or this, or this person over here"?
Oh, I don't know. I see a lot of, I wouldn't call them new artists, but they're new to me,
Uh-huh.
or new to this generation, that are out there. I really don't want to mention any names. I've been harassing John Romita Jr. to do something with me because, he was the first guy I met at Marvel,
Yeah.
and we've never worked together on
Oh
anything.
wow.
And I'm like, okay, Johnny, you got to draw something of mine, even if it's just a 10-page story. You got to draw something of mine. You know, um, as far as the characters, I don't know. I would, like every other writer, I'd like I'd like to be working on a franchise book. I would love them to like give me Superman, the way they gave Brian Bendis Superman, and
Yeah.
like, you know, it's like let this sort of creative mind, uh, whether it's mine or somebody else, come in and and kind of like, well, let's explore this direction for a while, or let's try this other thing for a while, and have a cohesive singular voice the way you had with Brian for a while,
Mhm.
or with even when they brought in Kirby, during the 70s, he was doing like Jimmy Olsen or something, and he was doing Forever People, and he like brought this unique voice to the thing, you know. So yeah, I think ultimately that would be something that would interest me, is to sort of be uh, the voice of a franchise. Like
Mhm.
let me handle Batman. Let me be like the god of Batman for a year, and let me play with all the toys, and coordinate with the other writers and all this other stuff, But that's really not the way it works, and I think that uh, it's possible that these days that publishers are really desperate to put eyeballs on books, to get people into the shops to uh, 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 increase sales or at least keep sales from sliding. And it's a tough racket right now. So having new and shiny tends to be the strategy as opposed to like, well, let's dust off Priest and give him the Flash. you
Yeah.
know I don't see them doing that,
I
but
would read a Flash book if
huh?
you I would read a Flash book if you wrote it.
I tried to pitch one. I was going to pitch a book called Barry. He's not the Flash now. He's Barry.
Mhm,
And what does he do with himself now that he's not the Flash anymore?
mhm.
But I think they're already doing something with Barry. And there's a million characters, but there's a million ideas, and there's a million creative people out there. So it's like, well, give me Zatanna. They've already got a Zatanna series. Oh, okay, well, how about Banana Man? Oh, we're doing like Banana Man versus Orange Boy. It's hard to know what they're doing because there's so much stuff in the pipeline and that kind of thing. And
Yeah.
so we'll just have to see what happens. I mean, it's really up to the companies. If there is interest, they have my number. They know how to find me. And in the meantime, I'm very happy doing what I'm doing. We're getting ready to irritate everybody with Red Sonja. Uh, as we're irritating people with Black Panther, we're getting ready to start a whole new level of irritation with what we're doing with a complete deconstruction of the Red Sonja character in ways that may seem disrespectful. And I don't mean to be disrespectful to Red Sonja. I'm just that twisted that we're doing this thing here where we have this demure English lady who's like a clerk, for some British politician, and she falls down a hole in the subway track, and she wakes up in Hyboria as Red
Oh.
Sonja. And the question is Maggie? Her name is Maggie. Is Maggie hallucinating that she's Red Sonja, or is this Red Sonja having this hallucination about this woman of the future named Maggie?
Mhm.
So which one is having the hallucination? But it's like it's like with like that film Rush Hour, where you
Yeah.
have like the ride along character who the experienced character has to explain to the ride along character, and by proxy the audience has to explain the world and how the rules work, and that sort of thing. I think Rising Sun, you had Sean Connery explaining this to Wesley Snipes, where he's explaining what it's like to be in this Japanese Bushido tradition.
Yeah.
So, for anyone who's never read a Conan book or never read Sonya or never was not even into sword and sorcery, it's called Sonya Reborn. And you don't have to know anything about her or anything about Conan or anything about Robert E. Howard, because we will take you by the hand. Because in this case, the main character, Red Sonja, is the sidecar character, because she wakes up and she has no idea about anything in the Hyborian age. And it's this deconstruction where we're taking this very serious look about how exactly does things work in the pre-cataclysm. How do you eat? Where do you go? How do you go to the bathroom?
Mhm.
What happens if you get sick? She gets cut, and she almost dies of an infection. Okay. She gets snatched by this monster and dragged through the woods, and she's screaming her heads off because she's terrified. And her squire comes running after her saying, will you stop making that noise? And she's like, "What are you talking about making that noise? I just got snatched by this monster." And it's like, yeah, but your men, your barbarian horde may hear you screaming. And if they hear you screaming, if they think that Red Sonja is weak and afraid, they will kill her. They
Yeah.
will turn on you because we're barbarians.
Yeah.
This is what barbarian means. So
Yeah.
it's this thing where she is learning how to be Red Sonja, how to be a woman alone, surviving in a world full of wizards and monsters, and everything in this world is out to kill you. And it's a very fun story. It's a very poignant story, but at the same time, like, Red Sonja purists, just like Black Panther purists who kind of hated us when we launched Marvel Knights Black Panther, and we gave Black Panther like an iPhone, and they were like, "How dare you give him an iPhone?" Because there was no such thing as an iPhone, so they found it ridiculous that you could have something this small and you have video and talk to people. That's preposterous. We've got letters like that, right? So, I'm prepared already for people to forget about whatever the hubbub is about the world to come and pivot immediately to like this desecration of Red Sonja, where like, we're doing kind of a Life of Brian, the Monty Python thing. We're kind of doing a Life of Brian with Red Sonja. But it's a great book. We're having a great time doing it. It launches in August. And is bound to irritate people who really like Red Sonja. But for new people who have never read Red Sonja before, it's the perfect jumping on point. It's like a primer to that world where we kind of take you through it and introduce you to Robert E. Howard's just fabulous legacy.
Well, you got me sold on it.
I sold one. Amen.
Well, yeah, it sounds like you got Vampirilla, you got The World to Come going on, you got Red Sonja coming out. Sounds like you got a pretty pretty full slate there too. Do you have any convention appearances coming up now that we're starting to get in convention season?
Yeah, well, I'll be in New Orleans. I'll be at Terrific Con, and I'll be in a couple other places. I have to look at my calendar. I always, every time I do one of these, I should probably write this stuff down. So I go, yes, as a matter of fact, there, I'll be at, but I'm a moron. I didn't. But I know I'll be in New Orleans, and then after that, I will be at Terrificon in Connecticut.
Do you know if you'll be at Baltimore Comic-Con this year?
I don't know. I'm so sorry. I don't know. I'll have to look on the calendar.
I asked that because that's the hometown convention for me. So every time I interview a creator, I'm like, "Are you going to be there?" It'd be cool if.
And it's a good one. I've been there before. Yeah, I've been there before. I don't know if I'm booked this year. Conventions, they will, as far as us puny comic book guys, they will tend to rotate us around. Like if I was there last year, it's like every 2 years maybe they might invite you back, but they tend to not want you to come back to back to back. If you were there last year, they probably won't want you there this year. Or if it's a big chain where they do a bunch of these things, then they rotate you around to the chain in some ways. But I'll take a look. If I find out I'm there, I'll drop you an email. How's that?
No, that would be fantastic. I met you at Big Lit Comic Con.
Oh yeah.
Here. Yeah.
Oh yeah, they do a good job there too. They do a great job. Yeah.
So thank you. I think almost 2.5 hours. Talking with you. So thank you for. I could sit here and talk with you all night. I got a ton more questions, but we'll save that for another time because I know that were.
Yeah, I've probably gotten myself in enough trouble tonight. Like that arrogant SOB. How dare he say Hal Jordan is the only Green Lantern? Oh, yeah. There you go.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me. For anyone that wants, I know he says on social media, but he does have a website here that he will update again one
of these days. Yeah, but there's a bunch of old stuff, up there. A bunch of cool articles up there. It's ChristopherPriest.com.
Yeah, but
the Vampirella sampler should be. I'm doing this from memory, but it should be priest.m_V as in Victor AMPI Vampy, and that should lead you right to a Vampirella sampler, so you can actually just read a bunch of pages from the book and get a flavor for what we're doing over there. And it won't be anything like you suspect. Whatever you think the book is about, it's not about that. There you go.
So check it out. Check out his upcoming stuff. Check us out online at thecodexstation.com. We got links to all the socials. We got links to the merch stuff, bios of all of us. Go check it out. Give us a sub. Thank you once again for taking the time to talk with me. I've really been looking forward to it. It was fantastic getting to pick your brain and talk about your amazing career with you.
Great. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Yes, sir. All right, everyone. Until next time, catch you by the spinner rack.
Hey, coders, if you like that, give us a subscribe. And if you want more content like that, definitely check out the videos above. Hope you enjoy it. There's a lot for everyone.